Okay, you are live now.
Okay, hi, everyone. Welcome to the San Ramon Valley Unified School District Board of Education workshop. We want to let the public know that we are video recording today's workshop, and the recording is being live streamed on the district's YouTube channel. And a link to the recording has been posted to the district website. I want to introduce the board. I am, despite what my Zoom or screen is showing, I am Susanna Ordway, president of the board, and want to introduce my vice president, Ken Mintz. Ken, if you can kind of wave.
I'm here, not video live.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, we can't see you, Ken. Okay, that's Ken. Our clerk, Rachel Hurd, and board member Shelley Clark.
Hi, everybody.
And Laura Bratt.
Hi.
Okay, at this point, if you can join me in a Pledge of Allegiance, a virtual Pledge of Allegiance. So, I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. That was a nice, kind of a nice image of the flag. Okay, great. Okay, so please may I have a motion to accept our workshop agenda today?
So moved.
Second.
Great. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay, great. Then we're going to start with our workshop, and I'd like to introduce our attorney, Harold Freeman. Hi, Harold, from Lorenzo Smith, who will present our board governance workshop for today. Hi, Harold.
Hi, welcome everyone. I feel like we're playing that old game show To Tell the Truth, where three people will say, my name is John Malloy, and you have to determine who the real one actually is. But I should mention I was doing a board workshop for another district on Saturday morning, and they spent their first 15 minutes trying to get everyone up on the screen and get everything going. And they asked the question, is this how it is for all the school districts when we're doing virtual meetings? And I told them yes. So I'm going to tell you the same thing. This is just part of, unfortunately, the nature of what we're doing now. So don't feel too bad about it. We see this. So what I wanted to do is just kind of, before we pop up the PowerPoint, which we will hopefully in a moment, I wanted to just sort of paint a picture of where we're going today. By way of background, first of all, thank you for having me along. I always love doing work with this particular district of all the districts I work with, because as you know, I have two kids that went through San Ramon Valley Unified School District. So I'm a loyalist at the end of the day. But by way of background, I've been doing this work with school districts through Lozano Smith, where I'm a partner, for 27 years. I used to count how many school board meetings I went to, and when I got to 1,000, I stopped counting because I got a little depressed, and that was about 10 years ago. So I'd say I'm probably around 1,500 by now. So I've seen a lot, I've done a lot, and what I'm going to try to do today as we go through these materials is not just throw a lot of law at you, but talk to you about examples I've seen, things that seem to work well, things that don't, just sort of some of the experience. And as we go through it, we've got several hours together. We've got a lot of ground to cover. Hopefully we'll make it through. As I warned the superintendent previously, I think it's more important to have thoughtful conversation about this. So for any reason we don't make it all the way through, happy to come back and do it again. And most importantly, if you've got questions as we go, if you want to raise any points, experiences you've had, questions you've got, please feel free to do so. It'll make it a whole lot more interesting and entertaining, and it makes me know that you're all awake, which is good. One of the things that I have as a challenge technologically is I'm on an iPad, which gives me really good audio and visual. But when the PowerPoint comes up, I will only see somebody if they are talking. So if I'm saying something and you want to ask a question, feel free. You've got the little raise your hand button, and I'll see that a hand is raised. Through the nature of the iPad, I won't see whose hand it is, but I'll know to stop and take questions. And as my wife has learned after many years of marriage with me, if I just keep going, please feel free to interrupt. You are more than welcome to jump in. I am not at all offended as we go. And really, this will be a richer experience for all. If you do have questions, if you have comments, things you want to share, not just for the board, but for the staff as well. So with that little background, maybe if Cindy can work the magic of popping the PowerPoint up on the screen that we'll be working through today. Look at that, it worked. I'm always so happy when technology works. Cindy is going to play Vanna White today, so I'm going to be telling her when to turn the page or go to the next letter. So with that, why don't we go to the next page and look at the topics we're going to cover today. So we're going to spend the first part talking about board roles and responsibilities. I've joked for a number of years that, you know, if you are drafted into the military and we go to war, they send you to basic training. But if you're elected to school board, it's a little bit more of a crash course. And so some of this will be old hat for some of you. Some of it will be newer. One of the things we'll talk about is your board policies and how they fit with all of this. And another thing that we'll talk about, which board members receive virtually no training on. So I've worked with board members who've been around for 20, 30 years as board members who are never trained on board member liability questions. So when may board members be liable for their conduct as a board member? And so that's a little teaser to make sure that you keep listening, because that's an important one. And then we'll do a bit of a deep dive into the Brown Act. One of the fun things about the Brown Act, for those of us who've been around for a while, is no matter how many times you learn it, you get to relearn it, because they update it every year. They change it, they twist it, new court decisions come down. So there's always some new nuance there. Almost every time I sit down to get ready for one of these workshops, I find something in the Brown Act I didn't quite notice before. And people sometimes jokingly refer to it as the Gray Act, because sometimes it's not as clear as you would hope it would be. So we'll spend a fair amount of time on that, and amongst other things, talking about, for example, why are we meeting in the format we're meeting in today? And segueing from that, we'll talk about the conduct of board meetings, really tied into a bit of the Brown Act. And then the last two parts, which will probably be less of a deep dive, but sort of covering some of the basics, is a little bit on the Public Records Act and some key takeaways there, particularly around emails and texts and electronic communications. There's been a lot of developments in recent years. And we'll end with ethics and public service. So talking a little bit about the conflict of interest rules that apply to you all. So with that, let's dive in on the board member role and responsibility. We can go to the next slide. When we talk about board member roles and responsibilities, every school district in the state has school board policies. Some call them policies, some call them board bylaws. We're talking about the same thing. And one of the things we don't spend a lot of time talking about is, what the heck are these things? Where do they come from? What do they mean? In essence, board policies are your own internal operating rules that you've imposed on yourself that not only set out practice, but set out vision, that talk about where you're trying to go and how you're trying to get there. And they are accompanied by administrative regulations, ARs, we sometimes call them, which are basically the procedural steps of how we're going to carry these things out. The origin of your board policies is the same as for about 900 plus of the 1,000 school districts in the state, which is that California School Boards Association publishes a set of bylaws or board policies that they update annually. And they are really the base of what school districts then adopt. Some districts tailor them, some follow the CSBA model more closely. The CSBA model often has options for you in it. Do you want to do X? Do you want to do Y? That lets you choose. And the reason that your board policies are organized like they are, if you go look at them, there's an 0100 series, 0200 series, 0500, 700, 900. That's all based on the organization of CSBA. So a fun thing with me working with 400 different school districts is you all have the same numbered policies for the same, to some extent, but they often say different things. They've often been tailored to your district. And then there's the fact that often when we talk about board policies, you'll have districts that may have not updated them in a number of years. And the risk you run there always is that there will be a change in the law and you'll have a policy that doesn't comply when you're expected to comply with both the law and your own board policy. So when we talk about the board policies today, that's really what we're talking about it coming from. And we'll talk about state law, federal law, regulations that come there from there as well. And I'll try to identify the source of the law each time. So if we can go to the next slide. So if you ever want to know about board governance, it's good to go read Board Bylaw 9005 and really the 9000 series in general. 9000, 9001, 9005 are all important ones. I'll let you read the words up on the screen for yourself. The key takeaway on this board policy, this board bylaw, is that your responsibility is to act in the best interest of everyone, all the students, all of the community, all of the employees. That every is a really critical part of your board governance. It's one of the struggles that school boards often have, because you will have people in your community or even on your school board who have different opinions, different views of things. So how do you act in everyone of their best interest? And that's really what your mission is as a group of 5. You can only take action as a majority of the board, so functioning as a whole, to try to determine what, in the end, what's in the best interest of all of the students, all of the staff, all of the community, of course, after listening to input from that community and those students and that staff. And you'll see there at the bottom where it says to maximize board effectiveness and public confidence in district governance, you're expected to govern responsibly and hold yourself to the highest standards of ethical conduct. We'll come back to that at the end when we talk about some of the conflict of interest rules. So I do really recommend, if you haven't spent time reading your 9000 series of board bylaws, it's a great thing to do. If the board ever wanted to, it's a great board workshop or retreat to just spend time reviewing that 9000 series and seeing, A, are we living up to it? And B, are there things about it that are out of date or that we'd like to tailor to our district? So we can go to the next slide. I sort of hinted this, that as an individual board member, you have no more authority than any member of the public. So you are simply an individual. It's within operating as a board in board meetings, as a quorum or majority of the board. You'll hear me say quorum or majority with your 5 board members. That's always going to be 3. So it's easy. I work with some 7-member school districts. It's harder to do that on one hand, so it's easier for you. So when you're in board meetings, you're acting collectively, you're acting as a board member. When you're outside of board meetings, you have no more authority, but you always have to keep in mind that people who are talking to you and chatting with you at Draeger's or Safeway or Whole Foods or Trader Joe's or wherever you happen to find yourself, they may have in mind that you are operating as a board member in that conversation. There's an old saying that you wear your board member hat and it's really hard to take it off. And so sometimes you have to remind people, this is my personal opinion, this is my personal view on this. Thank you for sharing this with me individually, but it always should end with, and this is something that the board would have to consider, or we'd have to consider collectively. From my experience working with school districts, where we run off the rails frequently is where those boundaries get confused about whether somebody's acting as an individual or as a board member. And I want to tell you a story, and it's a little bit of a funny story. Basically what happened was that somebody got elected to a school board. He'd been a volunteer in the community for years and at the district, great guy, pillar of the community. And when he got elected to the board, he was very excited about it. And so shortly after he was seated, he showed up at a school site with a card table and with the plaque that had his name on it from board meetings that board members were allowed to take home and bring to each meeting. And he put out the plaque and he had a copy of the education code with him, which is a nice thick tome. And he basically declared to parents as they were dropping their kids off at school that he was open for business. And everybody was mightily confused by this. What was this person doing? Was he sent there by the board? What was going on? And the principal called the superintendent in sort of a bit of a panic. What do I do? He's not really even authorized to be on the school grounds right now, and parents are asking questions and they're confused. They don't know what role he's playing. And they ended up calling me, and we all had a nice sit down with the board member and explained to him the confusion that was caused and the fact that he had not been authorized by the board to go sit as a board member at the school site. And he was extremely gracious about it. He understood the error of his ways and did not do anything like that again. But it's sort of a funny illustration. We all like to reach out to our community. Everybody on the school board has an interest in education and in some ways are educators at heart, if not literally educators. And as such, that you want to help people. And one of the things to bear in mind is you always have to, as you listen, there's that old saying, you have 2 eyes You have 2 ears and you only have 1 mouth. That's because you should be doing twice as the observing and listening as the speaking, and that's never truer than when you're a board member in the community. It's great to take in information. If you're giving out information, you have to make it very clear, this is my opinion versus this is the position that the board took. And we'll talk more about that as we go. So if we can go to the next slide. This is one of the really big challenges we see, especially with newer board members. That board member I just described is the perfect example. He was used to going to the school site. He was used to being the volunteer. He was used to getting his fingernails dirty, if you will. And now that he was elected to the board, he became a decision maker. It was not about going to individual school sites and meeting with everybody and rolling up his sleeves and getting the work done. It was about being a decision maker. And while you're always welcome to volunteer as a board member, you have to be a little careful about getting in the trenches. And as we go today, we'll talk about the reasons why. So we go to the next slide. I have just some quotes I enjoy on this topic. This is one of them on this notion of your role as a board member. Board work is head work. Hands are optional. And again, we'll talk more about what that means. So let's see what your board bylaws say. If we can go to the next slide. Board bylaw 9005, keep the district focused on learning and achievement for all students. And I want to emphasize the word all again. There's data that we'll talk about in a little bit that comes from national studies that basically shows that the districts that are the highest performing or most on the climb are the ones where, rather than making excuses about, well, we have a lot of English language learners, or we have a lot of migrant students, or we have a lot of lower socioeconomic, or we have a lot of wealthy and advantaged students. There's 1,000 different reasons you can give that, rather than using those as an excuse for not becoming high performing, they are recognized as challenges that you work with so that you can keep reaching all students. And your board bylaw 9005 in this regard is very similar to those all around the state. And where I see districts achieving, it's the ones who really keep the focus on that. And where I see districts struggling is when that focus is lost. And we'll talk about this more later. When you're talking about school board meetings, it's always good to look around and think, are we keeping the district focused on learning and achievement for all students as we're having a dialogue at board meetings? And one of the high warning signs you can get for a school board is if you have a school board meeting where student and education issues are barely even touched on. I'm pleased to say that's not been my experience with San Ramon Valley Unified, either as a parent or as your lawyer, as an attendee at your meetings in the past. I do have some school districts I've worked with over the years where you could walk out of a 4-hour board meeting and have no idea what business the district was in. Were they selling widgets? Were they building schools? Were they buying things? Was it about procurement? They really didn't talk about students and student achievement. And just as a footnote, one of your nearby districts, Livermore, I think does a really interesting thing at their board meetings, which I've always enjoyed. And I don't know how much they're doing it now that it's all virtual, but certainly when they were live, just about every meeting they have starts with something involving students. A choral group, a reading of a poem, recognizing of a student athlete, some acknowledgement that there were students. And it always set the groundwork that that meeting was about kids. It was about the students and that focus on all of the students, which is not to say that every district does that. I just mentioned that as a kind of nice tradition that they had in place. So we go to the next slide. This is again from this book, Doing Good Even Better, which, by the way, is a great book. It's an easy read. It's about how to be a board member, not for school boards, but for any kind of nonprofit board. And it's just good tips on managing these different types of entities. And again, the focus here, whereas the board decides ends or outcomes, management is responsible for the means by which the ends are achieved. The analogy I like to use is that you're all on a ship, and the board is deciding where, based on all the information it's given, where that ship is going to go. But questions as to exactly when to lower and raise the sail, and when to tack, and when to, stop for provisions, et cetera, is up to the staff that you hire to take you there. And you do that in partnership. And that's shown again in your board bylaws. So we can go to the next slide. this is this data that I was talking about from the 8 characteristics of effective school boards. It's a great read if you ever want to read it. NSBA put out this, it was put out in like 2011, I believe, but NSBA and National School Boards Association in 2019 sort of republished the 8 characteristics of effective school boards. What the Center for Public Education did was they gathered from several studies that were done nationwide on districts large and small, rural, urban, all kinds of different locations all around the country. They came up with some rubrics of really what are some signs of a high achieving school, not just test scores, although it's obviously relevant, or graduation rates, but signs of success, the board working together well, the community having trust in the board, et cetera. And they came up with these 8 characteristics that they outlined as to what really makes for an effective school board. And the one really that I wanted to mention today, because it's really emphasized in your policies, is that you spend more time on policy, less time on operational issues, and more times on policies to improve student achievement. So I want to give you a specific example here, which is I worked with a school district where the community had a community garden at one of the schools. And the folks that ran the community garden really wanted to expand it. And the district had an interest in, during the day, allowing its kindergarten and first grade students to go out, learn about the plants, do some basic gardening. It's kind of an exciting project. There was some grant money and other money involved to do the work. And we spent probably the better part of 3 months, probably 5 or 6 different school board meetings, just trying to figure out how this was going to operate. Until finally the superintendent looked at the board and said, why don't you let me just sit down with the folks that run this and figure it out and bring you back a plan. And I always remember that one because I felt like it was a moment where the board was realizing, and the superintendent was helping them point out, that they were talking about what kinds of plants to plant and which kinds of plants were appropriate for kindergartners to be working on, and should they grow from seeds or not. That was time talking about operational issues and not on policies. And that's something that you can all check yourselves on during school board meetings in particular. Are we talking substance or are we talking process? The more process you talk, the less substance you talk. And that's always a challenge for school boards. The data that this NSBA study talks about is that where you don't get this mix right, where you're spending more time at board meetings or otherwise in the weeds on operational issues instead of setting the direction and letting your professional staff move it forward. Different things that you see are administrative turnover, so loss of superintendents and high-level cabinet members, and even at school sites as well, staff morale problems, infighting amongst the board. These are all signs of dysfunction that you want to avoid. And San Ramon Valley has been blessed for the many years that I've lived here not really to have to deal with extreme examples of a lot of those issues. There's probably been moments here or there. Generally, your board gets along, you're cordial with one another, you have a respectful relationship within the district. But when we talk about these issues, there are things to watch for, because you sometimes fall into what we call mission drift, where you start moving away from this focus. And it's really easy to go from a high-performing district to a low-performing district in these regards. I think of one particular district that shall, of course, remain nameless, I worked with for about 9 years. When I started working with them, they were one of the highest performing districts in the state, highly functional. Everybody in the state talked about, how do we do it the way they do it? It was their model. How do we follow their model? In the course of 9 years, there was some board turnover. They went from a superintendent who'd been there for 12 years to, in that 9-year period, having 3 different superintendents. They went from having 1 CBO who had been there for over 20 years to having, I think, 3 or 4 CBOs in that 9-year period, maybe even 5. They were on mission drift. And by the end of the 9-year period, there was infighting. You went to their board meetings. There was no discussion about policy. There was a lot of discussion about facilities. That was a very hot issue there, but not a lot of discussion about policy. And at the end of the day, districts by the end of the 9 years that I worked with were saying, oh, they're doing it this way, then we don't want to do it that way. We don't want to model it on the way they do it. So I watched in 9 years a highly functional district go to a highly dysfunctional district. And it was exactly this issue. It was losing track of who was responsible for carrying out the plan versus who was making the plan. And there's a couple of good quotes. I'm going to give you the next one on the next slide. Comes from a governance handbook that's out there. Some school districts have governance handbooks, which basically distill their policies into, can be anywhere from 3 or 4 pages to 15 or 20 pages. They're basic operating rules, always something that you can think about having along the way, something you can look at. But a typical line within these governance handbook examples, and this really CSBA is the source for this as well, there are important distinctions to be made between the board's role and that of superintendent and staff. The role of the school board is not to run the schools, but to see that the schools are well run. Not to run the schools, but to see that the schools are well run. I give you back my example of the gentleman who was elected to the board and showed up at a school site to answer questions. It gets really confusing for people when those roles are blurred. If we go to the next slide for what your board policy says about that in Board Bylaw 9005, understand the distinction between board and staff roles and refrain from performing management functions that are the responsibility of the superintendent and staff. So that really embodies these concepts we're talking about. Sometimes it's hard to tell whether what you're doing is starting to step into a management function role. And there's a board member who I really adore at another school district who always asks this question because she has a tendency to really want to dig her fingernails into the dirt. And she will catch herself and say, am I getting in the weeds? And we all know what she means at that moment. What she's saying is she's catching herself and reflecting on, have I taken this beyond the policy discussion and now I'm starting to micromanage? And sometimes the answer to her is, no, this is great. And sometimes the answer is, yeah, you're getting into the weeds a little bit. But I love that moment of self-reflection. It's always okay to ask the superintendent when you're talking to them, am I getting too far into the weeds? You have a superintendent who I think really enjoys talking to the board members, and doing our prep for this meeting, we talked a little bit about this. And that's a very valuable thing to have. Take advantage of that. And ask, is this too much detail? Is this too much? Or is this an appropriate level of discussion that we're having? So go to the next slide. When we talk about what those roles are, the board determines the policies that define the operations of the district. So you have policies on hiring personnel. The board adopts the curriculum. You adopt the budget. You establish the budget priorities. You give direction in collective bargaining. But in carrying all of this out, you hire the superintendent to implement your policies. And ultimately, the superintendent is your employee. He is the one employee who you direct directly. All of the other staff in the district really report through the superintendent to you. And so the superintendent's in charge of implementing those policies, and the superintendent is really tasked with responsibility for that. If things are not going well in the board's mind, which I'm not suggesting that they're not, but over the years you may have some issue where you feel like there's not adequate progress being made, the answer is not to strip the superintendent of their authority and jump in and try to do it yourselves. It's to set goals with the superintendent, make sure there's reasonable expectations, and hold the superintendent accountable. That's really what the board's primary role is hiring that superintendent to carry out or implement those policies. If you go to the next slide, if you can hit the button again, I think the magic words will pop up. There we go. Stepping out of one's role and overlapping results in ineffective management. And if you can hit the next slide or the next button, oh, there we go. A lack of understanding regarding these roles leads to confusion and misunderstanding. And on the next slide, there's a quote I love about this from Doing Good, Even Better. Failure to make this distinction results in overburdening the board while management is demoralized and uncertain about its role. Boards which are involved in operations at the expense of their governance function are an impediment and perpetually on the verge of exhaustion. Again, the districts that I've dealt with that have gone into mission drift, where they float away a little bit from that big picture policy approach, this language of perpetually on the verge of exhaustion is exactly right. The board is exhausted and your staff is exhausted and your community gets exhausted as well. And so that's why I'm emphasizing this. Of all of those characteristics of the board, this is one of the most important distinctions that you can make. You can go to the next slide. Again, avoiding micromanagement is the important thing. You focus on the big picture. And if we can go to the next slide. The next slide quotes from another book that I love and highly recommend. It's called How Not to Be a Terrible School Board Member by Mayer. This is a really interesting book. It was written by a board member who'd been on boards for, I think, 20 years in consultation with a few other board members from around the state and other superintendents from around the state, some of whom I know. And it's a really fun book because what it does is it sets out maybe 30 different vignettes. It has just like a page-long discussion of a scenario that happens. And then there's a page of discussion of the board member's perspective, what went right, what went wrong. And then there's a page from the superintendent's perspective, what went right, what went wrong. It's a great book, especially for new board members, because it's experienced people hitting on where these things go wrong. But in How Not to Be a Terrible Board Member, they talk about crossing line into detailed management of the district. And I like these words: you've intruded rather rudely into the school administration's job and thereby have become a terrible school board member. I always wished he'd name the book something else because I don't like to tell board members when they're being terrible. Maybe How to Be a More Effective School Board Member is a better way of looking at that. And again, fortunately, these are not problems I think San Ramon Valley has been experiencing over the years, but it's important to understand these roles and to do these kinds of reiteration of what those roles are so that you stay on the course that you're on, so that you continue to be a high functioning school board. If we can go to the next slide, more from Richard Meyer. If you were not elected to administer the district, you were elected to oversee the administration. Again, you want to stay on the side of the line between oversight and management. So I'm going to pause here for a moment. I've talked to you a little bit about your board policies. We're next going to talk a little bit about your role in labor negotiations, which we're not going to spend a lot of time on, but I wanted to touch on some key points. Are there any questions, comments, observations anybody has about this sort of big picture look at the role of the board?
Well, sorry, Harold. Just want to make a comment that actually I really do relate to the sometimes, like really have to self-check, because like 2 years ago, actually, we implemented, at the district level, the strength finders, system where we're trying to find what are our strengths and where we're trying to make our relationships and our communications and working relationships with our district and each other, right? Maybe a little bit more effective. And it came out that my strongest strength was achiever, which means I like doing. And being as a board member, just like you said, I sometimes have to like check myself and say, oh, yeah, that's not quite my role. I better check with Dr. Malloy or, superintendent on whether or not, am I kind of overstepping? So really relate to that.
I have a question. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, please go ahead.
So now that this last 2020 election was the first election by area, and so obviously as a elected official that was elected by an area, I still represent the entire district. But it feels like it's a little more complex than that at large. So I don't know if there's any. I don't know if you could give me any advice in terms of how do I kind of balance that idea of being elected by essentially Doherty Valley and a little bit more in that, and yet representing the entire district. And this is a very large district. It's also unified, so it's it's complex, right?
Right. No, Laura, that is an absolutely phenomenal question, and I'm really glad you asked it, especially as a district that just recently moved to by trustee areas. When you made that change, your board policies weren't revised to say you are there to represent all of the people in Doherty Valley. It still says all of the people in the district. And when you're elected to the school board, it's your neighborhood, your area, your trustee area that's electing you, but they're still electing you to represent the entire district. One of the things that I've seen go awry in school boards that have moved to by trustee area election, and just for context, we're up to over 20% of the school districts in the state now. We're approaching 25 So this is becoming more and more common, is that you will start seeing board meetings where board members will say, my school, my area. And it sometimes starts to pull like taffy a little bit on this notion of achievement for all students. You're not really there as an advocate just for your area. Certainly you are there as an advocate, including your area, and you bring the perspective of being in that area. But I want to give an example. This is from a district that is based on trustee area elections, but it wasn't directly related to trustee areas. There's a school district that we work with that had 13 schools, and they were a K-8 district, and their enrollment had declined sufficiently and their finances were in enough trouble that it looked like they had to close between 2 to 4 schools. And so the district did an absolutely phenomenal job. They had a facilitated process. They invited the community. They had board member involvement. The principals were involved. And the early meetings of that group were really to talk about which, after they understood schools had to close, which schools are going to close. And everybody was talking in terms of my school. A parent from a particular school would say, you're not going to close my school, you should close their school. And through facilitation and a lot of work over the course of the better part of a year, by the end, people were talking about our schools. The boundaries had kind of been broken down from working with each other. And one of the most poignant moments was when the principal of one of the schools that was potentially being looked at stood up at one of these meetings and said, I've been advocating for not closing this school because I love it so much. But having seen all the data, seeing where kids live, seeing which district or which schools in the district need the most repair, I think I'm ready to recommend closing my school. And that was a sort of a stunning moment of looking at what was in the best interest of all. So I would caution you against, getting too balkanized, we call it, where each different country becomes its own separate ruling area. A lot of the really dysfunctional districts that I work with have trustee areas, and the trustees truly believe they represent only their area and will be outspoken about that. I would encourage you, when you're addressing issues, let people know, I'm from trustee area X, but I represent the whole district. The people of trustee area X put me in this role to do this. I think of it a little bit like Congress people. You're elected to represent your constituents who voted for you, but in the end, you're doing what is right for the nation. At least one hopes, current incidents in the Capitol notwithstanding, that's really the way that that's supposed to operate. So I think it's a great question. That's another place where I would encourage you to do self-checking and check in with each other. If you start drifting into too much, whenever I hear somebody start talking about my school instead of our schools, that's a warning sign to me. When I hear people talk about in my trustee area, as opposed to, the perspective from my trustee area is this, and how this relates to the district, I believe, is as follows. Those are really important things to do, especially somewhere like San Ramon, where, Alamo is a different community than San Ramon. It's a different community than parts of Doherty Valley. You have different demographics, you have different interests. One of the reasons I picked San Ramon Valley Unified School District as where to live when we were deciding to open up an East Bay office of my firm was I looked at it, and at that point you had 3 high schools. I loved how different the high schools were from each other. I liked that you were not a homogeneous society, that you had a lot of differences. So celebrate the differences, but the important part is coming together. Okay, well, shall we talk a little bit about labor negotiations? We'll go on to the next slide. I am happily not a labor negotiator. I say happily every year. The founder of my firm, Lou Lozano, says, Harold, do you want to start doing labor negotiations? And I say no, and the reason why is because once you start doing labor negotiations, it's hard to do anything else, because one of the lessons you learn is that negotiations are almost always ongoing or about to be reopened, as many of you have experienced. And that's a relevant consideration for the board, because you have to be very mindful about who you're talking to and what you're talking about in relation to labor negotiations, which are defined really broadly. So what I want to focus here is on how broad that scope is, so you understand how careful you have to be when you're talking in the community, when you're talking to teachers, when you're talking to classified staff, what your role is. So if we can go to the next slide, just a general statement of the law in the government code is that you are required to meet and negotiate with the exclusive representatives of employee bargaining units when they request it. when it's something that's within the scope of representation, of scope of bargaining, that the magic language here is exclusive representatives. Both the district as an administration and its employee bargaining units have exclusive representatives to whom people are supposed to talk about matters that are subject to negotiation. It is really important you keep that in mind, because you may find yourself in a conversation with a classroom teacher or a janitor or a particular school, and they start talking to you, for example, about a working condition at their school. You know, boy, the heat stays on all winter so badly, it needs to get adjusted. You may actually be talking about something that's a bargainable issue, and you have to be very mindful of that. Your role at that point is to bring that information back to to the superintendent, to the district staff, not to then engage in a discussion about the problem. And this is a really terribly awkward thing, because again, you're all doers and you're all helpers and you want to help. It's a good time to listen and bring that information back. And the reason why, if you go to the next slide, what I did under this is of the what's negotiable was I put up just some bullet points of things that are negotiable. So if we can go to the next page, I believe in not having crowded PowerPoint slides. And I crowded these slides on purpose because I wanted to give you the visual about how incredibly broad the scope of what's negotiable is. And you'll see all sorts of information on this page about salaries and stipends, benefits, fees. This is kind of the money things that are all negotiable. And then if you go to the next slide, it goes beyond that, though, to as all these things you see here about work hours, distribution of work, breaks, shift schedules, the school calendar, prep time, release time, all of these timing related issues are negotiable. If you think about it, this is a really broad list of things that are subject to negotiation. And it's the very reason why school districts spend so much time in negotiations at the bargaining table, because there's a lot of ground to cover. If we go to the next slide, when we talk about other terms of conditions of employment, you're also supposed to bargain over other terms and conditions of employment. Well, that's incredibly broad, right? And so we gave you some bullets here. There are things that are reasonably related to things like hours, wages, terms of employment, things that are of concern to both management and employees where conflicts likely to occur. I love this is all statutory language that this is based on. And the mediatory influence of collective negotiations is the appropriate means of resolving the conflict. That's incredibly broad. And if the obligation to negotiate doesn't significantly abridge freedom to exercise your managerial prerogatives, you go ahead and you negotiate if it's on an issue of fundamental policy. All of this is really, really, really broad stuff, which is why it's really easy to fall into, as a board member, talking to members of the community or members of collective bargaining units about issues that really should be saved for the bargaining table. And it's okay sometimes to say that. You know, this is really an issue, sounds like it's something more for your exclusive representatives to be bringing up. You'll also get people sometimes during negotiations that will come up and say, I know that we're at the table with you right now negotiating, but I don't think we're being heard on this issue. And the hard answer you have to give is, there are rules around this, and the answer is that we have to do it at the table. We have to be at the bargaining table. If you can go to the next slide, it just really continues on other terms and conditions of employment. And again, I don't want to belabor these. I put one in there just because it shows you the minutiae we get into. Bidding procedures for bus routes potentially can be bargainable. Non-teaching duties assigned to teachers, again, all very broad. And a lot of these issues come up obviously with school reopening and COVID, when you're talking about additional responsibilities about cleaning, for example, for classified and potentially for certificated staff. So this is very broad. The reason you want to be careful, if we go to the next slide, is that if you talk directly to a represented person while all this is going on during a period of negotiations, and the period of negotiations is often very long, that's called direct dealing or end run bargaining. If you engage in those direct discussions without flowing communications through the approved negotiators, you actually can get in trouble. And what direct dealing leads to, if we go to the next slide, you can be cited, the district can be cited for an unfair labor practice. Sanctions can get imposed by PERB, the Public Employee Relation Board. And there's a lot of scrutiny on these issues ever since the Janus case came down. That was the case that came down in 2018 that talked about union membership and whether a union could require that all employees in the district be a member of that union. And the court loosened that up. Well, California swung back that same year in SB 866 and imposed all sorts of new rules to tighten up those restrictions as much as they could under state law. And so there's a lot of scrutiny on this direct dealing issue. When are you talking to union members without it going through the union? That people are particularly sensitive about. So my answer on all of this is, if you're not sure, ask the superintendent. That's going to be my answer to a lot of things. Dr. Malloy made clear to me that he welcomes these questions. He welcomes the board's contact. And sometimes it's okay to tell somebody, look, I don't really know if I can be talking to you about this. I want to make sure. And to check with the superintendent. Sometimes the superintendent will check with legal counsel. Sometimes the answer is it's fine. Sometimes the answer is, yeah, we can't really be talking about this now. So I just kind of wanted to mention all of this because, especially for new board members, it's one of those things people don't talk about. Oh, I'm hearing from Rachel that the ability to raise the hand doesn't appear to be enabled. So I'm going to leave that to all the techie people. Feel free to just speak up if you have something you want to add. Rachel, did you want to comment on anything? Oh, have I scared
I wanted
Rachel?
to ask a question.
Yeah, please.
We do have kind of a standing practice that the superintendent and the president of the union have a kind of a free-flowing, not free-flowing, that's the wrong way to say it, but opportunities to discuss issues during the negotiation process. Is that different because they are the two heads of those organizations?
Yes, the easy answer to that is yes. You're not going, it's not that the union and the district don't know that the superintendent and the representative of the union are talking about those issues. And that really is wrapped into the whole collective bargaining process. It's very different for, I mean, I'll give you a concrete example. I worked with another district where we found out that one of the board members was meeting on the side with the union leaders during collective bargaining. That was end-run bargaining. It was going right around the district. And in the end, it was very awkward. The district was looking at bringing an unfair labor practice charge against the union related to the conduct of their own board member.
Yeah.
You don't want that to happen. There's a highly dysfunctional moment, right? But what you're describing, I think, is completely allowable.
Okay, thank you. That helps.
Thank you.
Actually,
yeah, for others,
I have a question kind of related to that too, because we also, I think, the board members may get requests from the heads, right, of the unions on just, you know, a conversation or something like that. And I mean, can you talk a little bit about, like, when is that okay and when it's not? Like should we just be listening and don't say anything, depending on what their, you know, their requests are?
I think that's a great question. I think it changes a little bit whether you're at the table with them or not at that point in time. If it's during a period of time when you're not in active negotiations with them, you have nothing reopened, you aren't working on the contract, you have a little bit more freedom. And at the end of the day, and we'll talk more about this under the Brown Act, each board member is still allowed to talk to their constituents. They're still allowed to talk to people that live in the community. They're still allowed to talk to staff. So none of what I'm saying today is, you know, by all means, stop talking to everybody and shut the door and be in the ivory tower. It's okay to talk to the union. Again, you need to be careful that it's not during a period of negotiation, and you probably want to be careful about it not going too deep into a subject of communication. You can often also tell if somebody's attempting an end run by the way they ask the question. And if in doubt, again, broken record, ask the superintendent. You know, check, I've been invited to this particular event. Is it appropriate that I go? I think there was another school district we work with where the union was very unhappy with the superintendent, and they were having a meeting of their membership essentially to decide whether to move forward with a vote of no confidence in the superintendent. And they invited two specific board members. And the two specific board members they invited, they perceived as being more labor or union friendly. And the board members checked with the superintendent, and said, should we be going to this? Should we be going there to listen? Should we be going there to talk? And ultimately, one of the board members decided not to go because they felt like it was getting into an area where it was an employee that the board is charged with evaluating, and they wanted to do that independent of this. The other board member decided to go, but very consciously told everybody there, I'm just here to listen. I'm not answering questions. I'm not a board representative. I'm just your invitee and here to listen. So you have to make your own decisions on that. The key is, one of my roles as a lawyer is to make you paranoid, right? It's to make you worried. And so it's always a matter of just stopping and thinking, just like before you hit send on an email. You want to stop, you want to think about it, you want to think about how it's going to be perceived. You want to be careful about people saying, well, I don't want to talk to you as a board member. I want to talk to you about, as Susanna, I want to talk to you about as a parent in the district, about your experience. What I said earlier, it's really hard to take off your hat, that board member hat. So they may still be seeing you there as a representative of the board. That's why I like that the one board member who did go to that union meeting that I mentioned, at least right up front said, I'm not being sent here by the board. I'm not here on behalf of the board. I'm not here to talk. My preference was the other board member who decided not to go at all to avoid any potential entanglements. I can't say that one was right and one was wrong, but I'm your lawyer and I want to keep you out of trouble, which is why we're going to talk about board member conduct and liability, actually.
I think your use of the word end run really helps clarify it, because if it's out in the open, the governance team and the superintendent have talked about whatever the interaction might be, it's different than it being done without their knowledge and without their basically approval that it's okay.
Yeah, Rachel, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And I was going to talk about this later, but I'll mention it now. The confidentiality of your board discussions in closed session about labor negotiations, it's critical to keep that confidential. And that's another one of those moments you'll be talking to people in the community. And I have this struggle as your lawyer, right? As a lawyer for school boards, I often have to stop when I'm talking to people and think, do I know this because I'm the attorney for the district, or do I know this because I live in the district? And if I'm not sure, I don't say anything. And I check, and sometimes I will just tell somebody, I'm not really sure I can talk to you about this. Let me check. And generally people are fine with that. So, well, let's talk a little bit about board member conduct and liability. This is one of my favorite topics to present on. We're not going to spend a ton of time on it, but the reason it's one of my favorite topics is I know that if I'm ever put in a position where I can get sued and somebody can try to take my house, I'd like to know that. And yet for some reason, the big hole in, no offense to CSBA and NSBA, the big hole in board governance training is that nobody talks to governing boards about where their liability is. You have JPAs and risk managers that do sometimes, but the board governance entities don't. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time on it, mostly to give you good news, because the lesson that you take away from all of this is that if you're acting within your authorized scope as a board member, you're generally going to be fine. Doesn't mean somebody can't sue you, but it probably means that you cannot be personally liable. The flip side is that if you're not acting within the scope of your role as a board member in an authorized way, you may not have that protection. So I want to give you the example again of the board member who went to the school site with the card table and opened up shop. If he ran over somebody's foot pulling into the parking lot, the district was under no obligation to provide him any defense or indemnification, and I'll talk about what those mean, to support him, because he wasn't there in his role as a board member. He went there as an individual. And I'll give you a concrete example, and it's a terrible example, and I apologize, but it happened, which is there was a group of folks that decided they were going to fix up a playground and install some new playground equipment at a school site. And the principal said, great, let's do it. They didn't check with legal counsel. They didn't look into whether prevailing wages were involved or how they had to acquire the equipment under the public contract code. They just did it. And one of the school board members who was a neighbor and whose kids had gone to that school wanted to help. And so they were there digging with those post-digging devices, digging down into the ground with, it was an auger basically, to make posts to put in this playground equipment. And this board member was operating the auger and actually hit somebody's foot. And it's gross, but he cut off the person's toes. So obviously it was serious. Fortunately, the person survived. It was, not a threat to their life. The first time that the CBO of the district heard about any of this was when he got a call from the board member that said, I was working at a school site this morning, first red flag, and I seriously injured somebody, second red flag, while we were working on the playground that, of course, the CBO knew nothing about, third red flag. That was a situation where if that parent who was volunteering had decided to sue, the board member would not necessarily have had any protection. Nobody knew the board member was there. They were really there in their individual capacity, not as a board member. And by the way, never, ever, ever, when you have parent volunteer groups that want to fix things up, do it without going through your business and facilities offices, because things like this happen. So the basic rule, if you go to the next slide, is that when you are acting as a board member, you are acting as a board member. You speak as a board member. When you speak as an individual, you make clear you're speaking as an individual. I'm here on my own behalf, or I'm here because the board sent me as the spokesperson to come talk to this group. Very, very different roles. And when you're doing so, if we go to the next slide, you want to ask yourself these questions. Am I authorized to say this? So if you're there on behalf of the board, did the board really tell you that you could say it, or are you drifting into your personal opinion without characterizing it as such? 2 is, am I creating risk for the district if I say this? And 3 is there any chance I'm creating personal liability if I say this? Where this comes up a lot is that a board member will, for example, go to a city council meeting. I'm thinking of a particular district I work with where there are a lot of issues of overlap between the city and the district because a lot of aggressive growth in the area. And a school board member was picked to be a liaison and go speak at a city council meeting to address a particular issue. And I had done the same presentation, and that board member told me afterwards she was really appreciative of it because she gave her planned comments, and then the board asked a question, or the city council asked a question she wasn't ready for. And the first thing she said to herself before she answered it, she was about to answer it, was, am I authorized to say this? And she realized, I don't know the answer to this question. The board hasn't taken a position on it. So that's what she said. What she was about to say is what she personally thought, which ultimately turned out not to be what a majority of the board thought. So it was very helpful that she said, am I authorized to say this? So if in doubt, check, be careful with it. We can go to the next slide just to see what your board policies say. Again, the 9000 series is all of your board governance pieces. And this really echoes just what I was saying, is that no board member shall be liable for harm caused by his or her act or omission when acting within the scope of district responsibilities. So the good news is, if in that terrible example of somebody getting injured at a school site, if you were going to a school site because you were being sent there by the board with the board's knowledge to participate in some event, for example, and goodness forbid you run over somebody's foot, you are not going to be personally liable for that because the travel was related to your tasked duties for the district. And that's a really important distinction. And if we go to the next slide, I give you the cites to the government code that support this, which is that the district must generally defend and indemnify a board member if they're acting within the scope of their authority. If you go read these government code sections, it doesn't say board member, it says district employee. It talks about public employees, but the courts have understood that to extend to board members as well. Just a word here, because lawyers sometimes fall into legal speak, so I want to make sure we're all on the same page. Defense, indemnification, and hold harmless are 3 concepts you'll hear about in the law. Defense means that if you're sued, the district has to provide you with a defense. They have to provide you with a lawyer or pay for the lawyer. Indemnification is that if you have a judgment against you, they have to pay it, so you don't lose your house. And then hold harmless, which is not mentioned here, is just that you're not going to be held personally responsible for anything that happens in your acting as a role as a board member, obviously acting lawfully within your role as a board member. So if you are clearly acting within your scope of your obligations and duties, you will be defended and indemnified. I will tell you that in your time on the school board, and I'm sure the members who've been here for a while will attest, that sometimes when somebody sues the school district over whatever it is they're suing, they will individually name each of the school board members. That's not to be mean. Plaintiffs' counsel are very cautious about suing everybody who may be possibly responsible. And they will often sue, for example, the San Ramon Valley Unified School District, the governing board of the San Ramon Valley Unified School District, individually name all 5 board members, and for good measure, throw in Dr. Malloy and a few others. That's just an opening shot that lawyers take, plaintiffs' counsel take, to make sure they're covering all of their bases. We frequently, as cases have moved along and actually moved towards trial, will get the individual board members dismissed from the complaint because they were just acting as board members. So the suit is against the district, not the individuals. So if you are ever served with a lawsuit, a process server hands you the piece of paper and it says somebody versus San Ramon Valley Unified School District and the board of San Ramon Valley and names you individually, rest assured that in almost all of those instances, the district will pick up the defense and the indemnification. You won't have to personally do anything. You won't have to personally hire a lawyer. It's one of the unfortunate realities of being on the board. If we can go to the next slide, it really just sums it up. Statements made by board members in conjunction with district proceedings are immune from tort liability if they're made in the course of official conduct. So one of the things that's kind of interesting is what happens to defamation? You know, you all hear about defamation lawsuits and they're in all the tabloids where stars are suing newspapers for what they said about them. Generally speaking, what you say at a school board meeting is protected by what's known as the legislative privilege. You generally cannot successfully be sued for what you say at a public meeting. When you leave that public meeting and you say it in the parking lot, somebody potentially can sue you for what they said, because again, you're stepping out of your role as a board member. Obviously, staying respectful, avoiding making egregious comments about people are all good ways of avoiding this ever coming up. But I did want to point that one issue out about defamation. We can go to the next slide. Really just reiterates what we said. Once you make the statement outside of the board member's official capacity, you lose all of those protections. Now, when I say you lose those protections, the board can still elect to defend and indemnify you. They're just no longer obligated to defend and indemnify you. And I've seen cases where there were wobblers, where it was unclear, did the person think they were acting within the scope of their duties, where the district did go ahead and provide a lawyer and a defense. So it's still able to do so. The next slide, please. Really just more of the same. Again, Government Code Section 995.2, are you acting within the scope of your employment, in your case, in your scope of your board member role? And go to the next slide. Another place to be aware of, which none of you will ever do, and this does not come up very often, but I feel obliged to say it because I'm a lawyer, which is that it's actually a misdemeanor in California for under Government Code Section 1098 if you release confidential district information for pecuniary gain, for some monetary benefit for yourself. This does not come up very often. Just wanted to make you aware of it, so I'm not going to belabor that. So we'll go to the next slide. Disclosure of confidential information. It's also important to know that under the Brown Act, and the section you see cited there of the Government Code is from the Brown Act that we'll be talking about more in a moment. If you release confidential information from closed session, a lot of bad things can happen. We sort of list the parade of horribles that can happen. You can be censured by the board. There can be a civil action against you for defamation, invasion of privacy, because obviously you weren't authorized to be releasing that information from closed session. So you lose that protection. There can be criminal action for willful omissions of performance of required duties, again, if it's for pecuniary gain. And you can be removed from office. You can have injunctions against you. You can be referred to a grand jury. And of course, your name can be all over the newspaper all the time, which is in some ways the worst of all of them. And I mention all of this to make sure you understand how serious the confidentiality requirements are of closed session. I was going to mention this later, but I'll mention it now. As an attorney, I'm in closed session a lot with school boards, and it's all virtual now. And I cannot tell you how often during virtual meetings, I will see somebody's spouse or child walk by the screen while we're in closed session. Don't do that. Closed session literally means closed. You don't tell your spouse, they're not invited in the room. My poor wife, again, I always have to use her as an example. For years and years and years, it drove her crazy because I work with San Ramon Valley Unified School District, and she would ask me, because she was a parent in the district and she was on the PTA at Twin Creeks and, you know, blah, blah, blah. she would ask questions about, so what's going on with this? And I would just have to tell her, I can't tell you, both for attorney-client privilege, but also because I learned it in closed session. And you know, after all these years, she finally stopped asking, which I really appreciate, but it's just hard for those that you love who are around you to not ask that question. We can go to the next slide. Again, it's just this parade of horrible things, but some of the negative consequences of releasing information from closed session, just for context, with labor negotiations, it absolutely can impact your negotiations. It can be a sign of bad faith bargaining. It could lead to unfair labor practices. It could be that end-run bargaining we're talking about. Here's one: revealing information discussed with the district's attorney, the school district's attorney, can result in a waiver of attorney-client privilege on the whole matter. So if you walk out of closed session having received information from your attorney, and you tell somebody in the community or a teacher or a friend or whoever else, and it gets out there, you potentially run the risk of having waived the district's attorney-client privilege. So you want to be very, very careful with that. That means opening up all of the advice you receive from your attorney. And that advice could be, you know, gosh, I think the district violated the law. It's not usually what you're hearing. It's usually you haven't, but you really want to be mindful and careful. Revealing information regarding a personnel matter, again, it can subject you to individual liability for defamation, for example, or invasion of privacy. We can go to the next slide. If you reveal information regarding students, you're starting to get into not just state law, but federal law. FERPA, the federal law on student privacy, prohibits you from releasing any of that information. And in fact, if you violate FERPA bad enough as a district, you can actually lose your federal funding. You don't see that happen. We've seen it threatened a few times, and I think it's only happened a very few times, but you really want to be careful. And then just a last example, I do a lot of work with real property. When you have the board in closed session discussing real property, whether it's buying or selling, you don't want the public to know what the board has authorized as a sale point. Because if you're buying, you may just have driven the price up more than we could have gotten it for you for. And if you're selling, you may just have driven the price down. And I mentioned this one in particular because I know a lot of board members I've worked with have a lot of friends who are real estate brokers. I don't know what the relationship is, but for some reason, real estate brokers and school board members get along. And school board members will be curious about one of these issues. You cannot share the information. You have to be really careful with that. So those are some words on school board member liability. This is the part where I try to scare you all. And I promise you it'll keep getting scary, and I hate to do that to you, but I think it's critical that board members know where they have protection and where they don't. Does anybody have any questions on that section, on the board member liability questions? No, okay. Well, maybe if I can, Susanna and Dr. Malloy, do just a time check. We're at 12:20, we're going till 2. We're about to start the Brown Act section. Would it make sense just to take a 5-minute break here, let people breathe a little bit and take care of any necessities? And I don't want to speak for you, but to the board president, if that's acceptable, maybe just a 5-minute break here.
Yeah, thank you for that, Harold. I think that would be a good idea, especially since I have a feeling we're going to dive deep into the Brown Act, and most of our discussion will be there. So yeah, that's a great idea. So we'll take a 5-minute break. What time is it now? 12:22, so about 12:27, 28, we'll be back.
Great, thank you.
Well, I saw her walking out into the garage when I was leaving, but she didn't say anything. She was just kind of looking at me. I was on the phone with someone at work. And she figured, yeah.
Okay, Harold, I think, I know that we couldn't, Ken doesn't have his video anyway, so he may be there, and I think we're ready to move on to our next part.
And I am
Great, thank you. So if we can get the next slide. We're going to be doing a deepish dive into the Brown Act. And when I say a deepish dive, this is one of those topics we could spend the next hour on, the next 2 hours on, the next 4 hours on, the next 8 hours on. It's an interesting body of law. And my objective today is to kind of highlight for you the key parts of it that you need to know. I'm not going to go into every possible detail, One of the things about the Brown Act, which is California's open meeting law, to be aware of is that there are several reasons for compliance with the Brown Act. The easy one is you need to comply with the law. And there are some serious consequences under the Brown Act if you don't. And we'll talk about all of that. The second reason is that it's a policy matter. I mean, there's been a policy decision by the state of California that you should do your business in public, that the public has a right to observe you conducting your business, not to be done in secret. And I think that that is a critical reason to comply. Sometimes when we're not sure about the exact language of the Brown Act and how it applies, we usually err on the side of more transparency for this very reason. But there's a third reason for it that we don't talk about as much that I want to surface, which is if somebody is unhappy with the merits of a decision that you've made, about a substantive decision you've made, they may raise Brown Act issues as a way of trying to stop you from moving forward with that action. It is the land of the redo. You didn't do this procedurally right, so we're going to make you go back and do it again. And it's really hard to make progress as a public agency if you have to keep doing the redo over and over again. And I will let you in on a trade secret as an attorney. I sometimes have to battle with cities and counties on behalf of school districts on various different issues. And when I do, the very first thing that I do is I start checking the city council, for example, their city council agendas. When they discuss these items, how did they agendize it? Because the first thing I'm doing is to see, can I get them? Can I get them? Can I get them on a gotcha and be able to require them to withdraw what they did and force them to do it again? And often that's a matter of trying to slow them down. The same is true if people are deciding to take legal action against a school district. That may be the first point that a sophisticated attorney stops at, which is, gosh, was there a Brown Act problem? And that's why I just anecdotally, I've handled lawsuits for school districts where they were sued for facilities issues and curriculum issues, after school activity issues, drivers training, you name it. And usually the lawsuit has in it a cause of action under the Brown Act, almost every time. And the reason why is you can almost always find some technical imperfection in what a school district or other local government does under the Brown Act. And the good news is that the Brown Act does not require you to be perfect. It requires you to make a reasonable effort and to have substantial compliance with the Brown Act. And so my goal is always to get you to the point of substantial compliance, knowing you're not going to be perfect because nobody's going to be perfect. I once gave a presentation at California School Boards Association at their annual conference on the Brown Act. And I was on a panel with a city attorney who was also a school board member, actually a community college district member, a school board member, and myself. All of us had a lot of experience. And we had a true and false test of 20 questions. And every question we gave, the audience was split true or false. And these were experienced board members. On all 20 questions, we didn't have any where there was consensus. And we did it specifically to illustrate how hard this is, about how many different areas where it's easy to trip up or see disagreement, or there have been recent changes. We actually had one gentleman come up to the microphone with a question. And instead of a question, he told us how angry he was at us because he didn't come here to be told maybe. He came to the presentation to be told black or white, and we were telling him gray. It's back to the Gray Act. And he actually stormed out of the room. I still feel bad about that one. But the other 400 people who were there stuck around and we worked through those issues. So I'll try to point out where there's some gray areas and common pitfalls along the way as well. And then the last thing I'll just say by way of introduction, the Brown Act applies to local governmental agencies in California. That's school districts, special districts like the Community Services District, fire districts, county boards of supervisor, et cetera. It does not apply to state government, which has its own separate set of laws that address transparency. So just be aware that you're not alone. It's all these other local agencies that we're in together. So let's go to the next slide and go in on substance. And as I go through this, please ask me questions. Please interrupt me, and if there's anything that's not clear. As I said, we have an ambitious schedule today. If we spend the rest of our time just on the Brown Act, I think that's fine because this is important stuff, and we can come back another day on the Public Records Act and conflicts of interest if so desired. So let's dive into it. So who is subject to the Brown Act? It talks about local legislative bodies. I'm not going to give you all the citations as I go, by the way, for what part of the Brown Act talks about this. The Brown Act itself is at Government Code Section 54950, 54950 et sec, which just means and the following sections. You either have or will have 2 items from our office that are good takeaways from this. One of them is you did get or will get something called the Board Member Toolkit. What this is a really short, user-friendly summary of the Brown Act, the Public Records Act, and Conflict of Interest Law. I have been told by some clients, they find it to be pretty plain English, and they actually bring it with them to board meetings for when these issues come up. The other thing that you'll all be getting soon, you haven't gotten yet, is we have something called the Brown Act Handbook, which is over 100 pages long. It's much longer. The 2021 edition is just about to come out. We update it every year for changes in the law. I'm the final editor of it. I just signed off on it, so it should get out soon. And that will go to all of you. It goes to all of the school board members for all of our clients. It is a plain English summary that's much more detailed about the Brown Act. It's the actual text of the Brown Act. And then it's models of, for example, what does a sample board agenda look like? What is a sample outline of what to do during a disruption during a board meeting? It's got a lot of useful tools. The reason I mention that is I would actually give you the homework assignment if you're willing to read the Brown Act. I know that sounds like a punishment, but it is always interesting to me that for folks who live with this all the time, we don't spend a lot of time just reading it, just sitting down and reading it. And you'll see there are whole swaths of it that are not particularly relevant to you. It's for other kinds of entities. So it's pretty easy to tell when you can skip a section. But in those materials, you find what you see up here on the screen and so much more. So legislative bodies are covered. This includes people who've been elected but not yet assumed office. It's one of the oddities of the Brown Act is that as soon as you are quote unquote elected, doesn't say whether it's certification of the election, it's really unclear. So basically once it looks like you might have won the election, you should start behaving along with the Brown Act, meaning that if the board members are talking about something, you always have to count a quorum. Or you've got to get to that 5 board members. If you have 3 board members discussing something, you have a Brown Act issue. And we'll get into that in more detail. Well, as it turns out, if you have 2 board members discussing something and somebody's just been elected discussing with them, that still counts as a Brown Act problem. So just something to be aware of. That's one of those common pitfalls people don't know. And then I'll talk to you about committees of the board and when the Brown Act applies and it doesn't, and we'll come back to that. But be aware that legislative bodies is defined by the legislature to include certain board committees and subordinate bodies that you've got. So we'll circle back to that in more detail. So the next slide is my one slide, if you had to know what the Brown Act says slide. What are the basics of it? It's that actions and deliberations are supposed to be taken openly and in public. That's the basic tenet. When you make decisions, when you discuss things, it's supposed to be open and in public. It's supposed to be in public unless a closed session is specifically permitted by law. And we'll talk about what those exceptions are that allow for closed session. One of the common mistakes we see is that people say, oh, this is a sensitive issue. How do we get it into closed session? That's not the way closed session is supposed to work. It's supposed to be, does this fit within one of these enumerated statutory exceptions that allows us to go into closed session, which does sometimes mean you have to have very awkward discussions in open session on topics that probably people would feel better if you could go into close. But it's important to stick within the limits of what the Brown Act provides. Your agendas and board packets have to be made available on request. Generally speaking, they have to be posted on the district website. Actually, now they always have to be. Up until a couple years ago, you only had to post the agenda on your website if you had a website. Finally, the legislature figured out that everybody has a website, so now you have to do it. The next thing is that you have to have a direct link to your agenda on your website. That is a new requirement that went into effect in 2019. And I'm going to speak very generically here. There are a lot of school districts in the state that have not yet fully complied with this section. So it's really advisable to go back and look at your website and see if it complies. I'll talk about this in a little bit more. I guess I can talk about it here. What the law literally says is that you have to have a one-click prominent button on your main web page that takes you to the board agenda, unless you have an outside service like Board Docs, in which case you have to have a one-click, one-stop you go directly to your board docs link. And so it's important to double check that. We've started to see people challenging school board actions. I'm defending one right now because somebody is contending that there was not a direct link to the agenda. And so guess what? Somebody's unhappy with the decision the school board made in that case. And so they're looking for things that they could say were a Brown Act violation and a redo. So certainly something worth going back and looking at. I would hazard to guess that probably over half of the local agencies in the state have not come current yet on this section, but it's an important one. And then the last thing, just as a quick refresher, is that the vote of each member has to be identified. So you cannot have secret meetings. There was a legislative change because there was a Brown Act body in Southern California, I can't remember what kind of body they were, that had 17 members. And they used to vote aye or nay without going down the line for roll call. And nobody in the audience can tell what just happened because 17 people were voting. So you hear a bunch of people say aye and you hear a bunch of people say nay. There were debates about whether more said one or the other. One of the other twists with this, and it's something to pay attention to during the time that we're doing all this remotely, because you have to identify the vote of each member, and because the Brown Act says if somebody's calling into a board meeting telephonically, the vote has to be by roll call. The general best practice is that you take all of your actions in a virtual meeting by roll call. Every vote is a roll call vote. That helps you when, like, poor Ken doesn't have his image up today because of some technology issue of knowing exactly how each person voted, not making people guess. So this page is the Brown Act in a nutshell. If only it were that easy that this was the whole Brown Act, because then you get into the devil, which is in the detail. So now we're going to start going into some of that in more detail. And we go to the next page. So what the Brown Act says about what a meeting is: if you have a meeting, it has to be agendized. That agenda has to be made public. You have to follow all the rules that were just on the refresher page we had. What it says is that any congregation of a majority of the members of the legislative body, so 3 or more for you, when discussing school district business, that's a Brown Act meeting. That's a board meeting. It's kind of counterintuitive, right? So the law used to say, prior to, I think it was 1994 or 96, I can't remember when it changed. It used to say, actually it was later, it was a 2008 change. It used to say that it's a meeting and you have violated the Brown Act if you are taking action or reaching concurrence. Well, in 2008, the legislature did away with that. They just said, all you have to do is be discussing district business, which means the following: if 3 board members go to the movie theaters once they reopen, you weren't planning on going together, but you see each other and say, hey, let's sit with our families together. You all sit in the same row. And during one of the lulls before the movie starts, somebody leans down and says to the others, hey, did you all catch that at the football game last night that there was a problem with the lighting, the nighttime lighting? And I'm wondering if that's something the school needs to take care of because I'm concerned about safety of football players. Okay, you have that conversation. The other 2 board members share their thoughts. Is that a school board meeting? The answer under the Brown Act is that you have a majority of the members of the board discussing school district business. You are having a board meeting, even though you didn't know you were having a board meeting. It is that broadly defined. And obviously where you start really running into problems with this, and we'll spend some time talking about, is social media, emails. That can all start to become a board meeting. So why are we today having an agenda? Why is there a posted agenda for this meeting? Why is it considered a special meeting of the board? It's because we have 5 board members here. We have the quorum of the board, and we're discussing school district business. We're not taking any action on anything. There's no proposed action. There's no concurrence being reached. You're just receiving training. That's still a school board meeting. Arguably, before 2008, you can make an argument it wasn't. Since that change in the law, it just is. And so you really have to be careful whenever you start counting to 5, really whenever you start counting to 3, that you may be having a board meeting without the appropriate notice. And I will just tell you up front, I've rarely seen purposeful violations of the Brown Act, where a quorum of the board meets in secret in a dark alley somewhere at somebody's house to plot something. I have seen it happen, maybe 2 or 3 times in 27 years I've seen it happen. It's almost always by accident. Brown Act violations happen just because people stubbed their toe because they didn't catch that something was going on. They didn't notice it quite right. And so you really want to be careful about those inadvertent meetings. Good news is there's some exceptions. So if we go to the next page, the legislature laid out a list of things that are not considered meetings under the Brown Act. And I want to go through those briefly. One is individual contact. If one of your voters in the district or a teacher or whoever else it is wants to come talk to you, that is not a Brown Act violation. Attending a public conference is not a Brown Act violation. So when the board goes to the California School Boards Association conference, which will hopefully be live again someday, that is not a violation of the Brown Act if you do not spend time together as a quorum discussing district business. So if all 5 of you go and see this great presentation on special education, and there were takeaways from it that you're really excited about, you want to talk about it, you wait until you get it back and you get it noticed for a board meeting. One of the things some districts I work with do that I really like is their first board meeting after CSBA. During board reports, they actually have each board member report on their takeaways from CSBA. Hey, I saw a great presentation on this. We learned about the New York School for Reading and how we're going to implement that is a really interesting thing to me. I want that on a future agenda, but you discuss it as a board later at a notice meeting. You can go to community meetings. The Art and Wind Festival. You can go to the Art and Wind Festival. There's a community meeting, right? You just can't stand around and talk about district business. You can go to other local agency meetings. So the entire board can go to a city council meeting in San Ramon or a town council meeting in Danville or a board of supervisors meeting for Contra Costa County. If you do so, you again cannot sit amongst yourselves and discuss district business. And this is an interesting one because you also have to think about appearances, right? If somebody sees 3 board members sitting together at a city council meeting, they're going to immediately think you're talking about what? School district business. And so we sometimes actually, if we know a quorum of the board will attend the meeting of another agency, we'll actually notice it at a board as a board meeting. Well, it's a very short notice that we post. It basically says a quorum of the board may attend the city council meeting of such and such a date for discussion of such and such an item. You don't open the meeting, you don't have the flag salute, you're going to somebody else's meeting, but the public's on notice that a quorum of you may be there and that district business may get discussed. So it's just a good practice, not necessarily required, but a good practice. Social gatherings, you can all go to each other's kids' weddings, bar mitzvahs, birthdays, anniversary parties for one another, etc. Again, can't discuss district business. And then the last 2, I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to ask you to forget that you ever heard them because the legislature allows for them, but they're a terrible idea. One is attending a standing committee as an observer only. So this is an ongoing standing committee of the school district. I caution you from going, even if you're just there as an observer, because board members who are not on that committee attending can have a pretty chilling effect on the discussion. And it starts to raise the question, why do we have this committee if the board members are going to go to all the meetings anyway? And I've heard that from committees where the board members come and watch, where they say, we just felt like there was no reason for us to be doing anything because the school board was doing it. And then the last one, which is a truly terrible idea when we go back to all the good board governance discussion that we had, is you are technically allowed to go watch and not participate in or discuss at staff meetings of your staff. I guarantee you, if you want to have the most quiet staff meeting in the history of the world, have board members go watch, and it starts to become that overstepping of bounds. Certainly, if that's something you're ever interested in doing, it's something you'd want to discuss with the superintendent. So that's what the Brown Act says is not a meeting. You have meetings, you have not meetings, and then you have the dreaded serial meetings and meetings through intermediaries, which is usually where we see Brown Act violations accidentally happening. So if we can go to the next slide, you can have a board meeting without all being in one place at one time. And the 2 classic examples are the chain and the hub and spokes. Those are both language that the Attorney General of California uses. The Attorney General, by the way, has a great Brown Act handbook. I really enjoy it. It's really helpful. It's also probably, 15 or 20 years out of date. So I don't highly recommend it as a legal source, but they have some good discussion of these issues, chain of communications and hub and spokes. So what do we mean? I'm going to refer to your board members now generically as A, B, C, D, E. You have 5 board members. If you have a situation where board member A talks to board member B about whatever discussion is within the subject matter jurisdiction of the district, and then B talks to C about the same topic, you've had 3 board members talk to each other, even though you haven't closed the loop. C never talks to A. C may never hear what A had to say. You still have 3 members who are discussing the issue, and that potentially is a serial communication in violation of the Brown Act, which you don't want to do. The hub and spoke model is similar. We have too many spokes on that hub and spoke that you see there, but you have one person, person A, talks to B, and then they talk to C, and then they talk to D, and then they talk to E, never sharing the information back from each other. A board meeting is still happening. So whenever you have a quorum of 3 people directly or indirectly communicating with each other, it is technically a board meeting that should have been noticed as such. Back in the day, before everybody carried around a computer in their pocket and we all emailed and texted each other constantly, it was a hard thing to violate by accident, right? You could tell pretty easily if, somebody comes to you and say, hey, I just talked to such and such and I want to talk to you about it. But we find by email, it's really easy to violate this, in part because people forward emails. So, hey, board member A sends board member B an email that board member B finds really interesting. They send it to board member C. You have a problem, because if it's on a subject matter, again, that's within the jurisdiction of the district. What the heck do you do if you find an article in the New York Times about education that you think is great? You want to share it with the board? My advice is always you give it to the superintendent, and the superintendent can share it with the board as part of a Friday update. And in fact, I even like when the superintendent doesn't mention who sent the article, because then they're not sharing somebody's opinion. They're basically just saying, hey, board member shared with me this interesting article. Here you go. And you avoid one of these accidental violations. You can violate these through an intermediary. My favorite example of this was a case that was years and years and years ago, and it was a published appellate opinion. A city attorney, of all people, he should have known better, right? The city attorney called all 5 board members on an issue and polled them. Hey, will you support this if we do this? And he asked the next one, will you support this if we do this? Will you support this if you do this? What the court found was that was, in the end, a hub and spoke kind of serial meeting that was a violation of the Brown Act, because the district was basically using their legal counsel to take a vote. He was getting a poll from the board as to whether they'd support something, and the public has a right to see that. So that was found to be a Brown Act violation. I would imagine that city attorney was pretty embarrassed. If we can go to the next slide. I touched a little bit on this. One of the really, really hard things under the Brown Act is, what do you do with one-way transmission of information? So years and years and years ago, I had a case when the internet was still fairly young. Yes, I'm not old. And board members had not really picked up yet on being careful about emailing out to the group. Board member A had thoughts about a school closure issue and emailed those thoughts to board members B and C. The reason he picked B and C is they were the 2 longest tenured board members, and he was interested in getting their thoughts. So board member A communicated to board member B and C. Board member B and C never responded. They let the superintendent know, let the board member know, cut that out. But unfortunately, one way or the other, the district attorney found out about this, and an assistant district attorney who was very excited about making a name for himself decided that it was a Brown Act violation and came down pretty hard on the district. And this was all innocent intent. And we argued, well, hey, this was one-way transmission of information. It was not communication in the sense of a response. And the city attorney said, or excuse me, the DA said, no, it's still a violation of the Brown Act. Well, this issue's bumped around the state for years. And finally, about 4 years ago, the legislature passed a new provision within the Brown Act. And what it says is that an employee or official can communicate with, quote, members of the legislative body if they don't communicate to members of the legislative body the comments or position of any other member or members of the legislative body. So let me break that down for you. What that tells us is that if the superintendent sends you something to answer a question, to provide you information, that's fine under the Brown Act, even if he sends it to the entire board. But if in that he says, I am sharing this with you because board member B had a concern about this issue and felt something should be done about it, they are now communicating the position of another board member. And that could be a Brown Act problem. This is a really, really tough one to try to sort out. So what do you do where the board member, for example, in the same case that I had in that DA case, what do you do if one board member sends their thoughts on something to the other 4 board members and nobody responds? They just send it out one way. Is that a one-way transmission of information that doesn't violate the Brown Act, or has one board member's thoughts been shared with the rest of the board? And we're not entirely sure what the answer to that question is. I'm going to come back to it in relation to social media, because there's a new law around social media on this. So my answer to you is, when faced with that, better to tell the superintendent, let the superintendent decide what information can be shared. Another question that comes up is, can board member A talk to board member B? Just 2 board members, it's not a quorum of the board, about an issue that's within the jurisdiction of the district. We believe the answer is, and has been and will continue to be, yes, you can, because that's not a quorum of the board meeting to discuss an issue. It's less than a quorum meeting to discuss the issue. So as far as we know, that's still okay. I say as far as we know, because this new law, this first bullet on this page, our newer law, makes it a little unclear. If the superintendent cannot communicate the position of board member A to board member B, can board member A still communicate their position to board member B? Can't do it through the superintendent. It looks like you can still do it directly, which is a total anomaly. So we're waiting for someday somebody to get sued and for a court to figure that out. I just ask that it not be you. And towards that end, again, if you want to communicate something with other board members, check with the superintendent is usually a safe way to go. So let's talk about the new rule for social media. Really excited about this one on the next slide. So effective January 1st of this year, so this law is 24 days old, the legislature for the first time in California addressed how social media gets treated under the Brown Act. Yay! The reason I say yay is because California was one of the last states in the country to do this. The home of Silicon Valley, the heart of the invention and spreading of social media, and we had no law in the state on this. The reason I think we had no law in the state on this is something that the CEO of Twilio, a cloud computing company, recently said, which is you shouldn't have legislatures legislating about social media until they understand social media. Unfortunately, I don't think our legislature understood social media. So the law we got is a little bit unclear. If we can go to the next slide. This is AB 992. I get very excited when I get to talk about brand new laws like this because they're shiny and new and completely confusing. So I tried to break this down by in one column saying what this law says you can do, and the other it says you can't do in social media. This law is found in the Brown Act. It was part of the government code. It was added to the Brown Act. So things you can do. You can go on social media. That seems pretty obvious, but there was no law in California that clearly said under the Brown Act you could go on social media. While there, you can answer questions from the public. You can provide information to the public. Again, remember what we talked about, clarifying, is this your opinion? Or are you doing something on behalf of the board and clarifying that? And you can solicit information from the public regarding things that are within your jurisdiction. So you can ask people, hey, what do people think about this? You can kind of informally poll even if you want on social media. The 2 things you cannot do on social media is that a majority of the board can't use social media to discuss the matter amongst themselves. So board member A can put something out there that says, hey, I want to know from the public, what do you think about school reopening? Because gosh, you haven't heard enough about that already. Always good to get more information, right? That's fine. Another board member reading that, even if all 4 board members read that, is okay. That's new. It was unclear before whether that was okay. Now under this law, it looks like that's okay if you're a passive recipient of it, if you're just reading it. But if you respond, then you have a problem because now you're starting to use social media to discuss amongst yourselves. If only one of you responds, maybe you're okay because it's not a majority of the board. But how do you know when you're responding that somebody else isn't typing the response at the same time? And so that's the problem you get into. And then that last bullet, any member of the legislative body is responding directly to communication from another member through social media regarding something within the subject matter jurisdiction of the district is prohibited. You cannot respond directly. Okay, well, I just told you, can one board member respond back to the other one? The first bullet seems to say yes. The second bullet seems to say no. And now you start to see why this law is not as crystal clear as it can be. What we've distilled from this, and I think we're all in the school law community still trying to sort this out, is the following. We think it's now okay for you to put information out there on social media as a board member. We think it's okay if other board members see that information, read that information, understand that information, but we recommend that they never respond to you directly or even indirectly trying to get into that conversation. The classic example, you all know Facebook, thumbs up, like. If you like somebody's posting, you are responding directly to them on social media. And so we have over the years struggled with this issue about something as innocent as a thumbs up like after a school board member's posting. Is that a Brown Act violation? We didn't know the answer. This statute seems to suggest it might be a Brown Act violation. So really, if you see something from another school board member on social media, you should not be responding to it directly. The indirectly part you should take care with. And again, if in doubt, check with the superintendent. We will know more about this law in a year or two than we do now. It literally is brand new. We suspect that it may get tweaked along the way. We certainly anticipate that there'll be some legal challenges that will test this. Once a legal challenge is filed, it usually takes about 2 to 3 years to get to the Court of Appeals to get a published opinion that tells us what the law is. So welcome to the Wild West of social media use. We have a new sheriff in town, but we're not quite sure that that sheriff is intelligible at this point.
I have a question, Harold.
Okay.
Yes, please.
So with regards to being permitted to answer questions from the public or provide information, things like that, on social media. But I went to a session at the school board, California conference, annual conference. And they did mention a public group versus a closed group, like a Facebook group or something like that. So are we, and I think that the advice there, just, to be careful that we don't, we can't really put out information even from a closed group because it's a private or closed group. Is that correct? Or
yeah, that's an area that nobody knows. I know the exact session you're talking about because a lot of people called me after that session to ask what it meant on this very issue about closed groups versus open groups. And the issue really is, if you have a I'm going to use Facebook as an example. If you have a Facebook closed group, so it's a particular neighborhood, for example, or it's all the parents at a particular school, for example, and you have 3 board members who are part of that closed group. How does this law apply to all of that, as opposed to it wasn't a closed group and you just have 3 board members going on Facebook generally? We don't have a distinct answer on this yet. If it's in the closed group, I would argue all of the same rules that you see apply here, which is a majority, so 2 of those board members, well, really it's all 3 at that point, can't use it to discuss amongst themselves. Because it's a closed group, one might argue that they are discussing amongst themselves because it's not just amongst the world, it's amongst the closed group. Where I somewhat disagree, I think, with what I heard coming out of CSBA is I think that the scale makes a difference. If it's a closed group of 12 people, you have 3 board members in, I'm highly concerned about that because that's really discussion amongst those board members. If it's a closed group of 200 people, it's probably not been created just so those board members could speak to each other. And so I think this is going to boil down to its facts. Whenever there's an alleged Brown Act violation that actually gets to court, it's a very, very fact-driven analysis that the court will give. I think they look at common sense. If you're not sure, don't participate. Just watch. Don't type anything in the closed group. Is probably the safest answer. I think I'm not ready to say, no, you can't be a member of a closed group if there are 2 other board members who are members of that closed group. But I know there are attorneys out there who think to be conservative, that's what you should do. So it's a matter of how much risk you want to take. But if 3 of you are in that room, as it were, you should not be discussing amongst yourselves. You should not be responding directly to each other, which pretty much means if one of you says something that the others are going to have to be pretty quiet. And again, if it's a very closed group, 12 or 20 or 30 people, I wouldn't suggest a majority of the board members even be participating in that. Does that help, Susanna?
Yeah, no, definitely. Thank you.
Hey, Harold, this is Ken.
Yeah.
Quick question. in the permitted area where you're talking about providing information to the public, I'm just wondering about the definition of information. We're talking about information that is publicly available information as opposed to a board member who provides their view on an existing issue. The reason I ask is in social media, if you have multiple board members that are reading the opinion of another board member, doesn't that become some form of, you know, a chain of information or?
Yeah, no,
Yes.
yeah, Ken, I think I understand the question. And as I read the new statute, and again, it's a brand new statute, it doesn't define what it means by information. I think it left open the possibility that a school board member does share their opinion, but then you have to go over to the prohibited side. Nobody can respond to that. So no other board member can respond to that. And if it factually comes out that the reason they're sharing their opinion and the other board members are sharing their opinion on that same site is to come up with some consensus or discuss an issue, you've got a problem. And when I said at the beginning about the Twilio CEO saying you shouldn't legislate about social media unless you understand social media, I think this is what he was talking about. It's really unclear from this. So as I read the statute, I think you can share your personal opinion on an issue that's going to be in front of the school board. And I think other board members can passively review that without responding to it. I think the better practice is not to do so. And frankly, the better practice, I get a lot of discussion going in board workshops when we talk about if somebody in the community comes up to you and says, what are your thoughts on this topic? You know, what do you think about school reopening? What do you think about English language learning programs? Whatever it is, what do you think? That is one of those moments I go back to my 2 ears, 1 mouth notion, which is it's good to listen to what the person has to say. And my favorite answer from a board member that I have ever heard is, hey, if you want to hear my thoughts on this, come to our board meeting on X date, because the board's going to be discussing it then. And that's my forum to let everybody know what I think. Do I think that this law requires you to do it that way? No, but I think it's a better practice. And I think it gets at the concern you're raising, Ken, which is it feels wrong, right? Even if you could argue legally it's okay, it's starting to feel like you're going too far in this direction.
Yeah, that's kind of my take on it, because even before social media, just if a board member were to be quoted in a paper and state how they plan to vote on something, it's not a dialogue between board members, but it's an opportunity for other board members now without public discourse or dialogue to know where someone is going to vote, and that could throw that conversation outside of the public environment. The better practice is just not to do those things, but yeah, just trying to get a sense of where the law actually stands on it, I guess is my question.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, yeah, and this is one of those areas where sometimes you focus on the letter of the law and sometimes you think about the intent of the law. I think the letter of the law would say it's okay. I think the intent of the law, everything you said is exactly a legitimate concern. And again, I love that answer of, I would love to talk to you about this, but the place that we talk about, I want to hear what you have to say, member of the public. I'm formulating my thoughts. I want to hear what my fellow board members say. I want to hear our staff report. If you want to see how I'm going to vote, what I think about it, please come to the meeting. It goes back to good board governance too, right? Because you're saying we operate as a body. I don't want to tell you where my leanings are until I have all the information, which is hearing from the student board member and hearing from the board and hearing from the principals and hearing from the teachers union and hearing from the public. I want to digest all of that before I vote. So the best board members in my book don't go around advertising how they're going to vote on something. You can always say, people know my opinion on this because I stated it publicly when we had this meeting 2 years ago. And I love the answer there. If you want to see what I had to say, go look at the recording of that meeting. I'm here to listen to you more than I am to tell you how I'm going to vote. That's what board meetings are for.
Good. Sounds good. Thanks.
Yeah.
So this suggests to me that when we're having, go ahead, Shelley, you can go first.
Thank you. I just wanted to go back to the closed group communication on Facebook. When I read a part of the statute, it talked about groups that are controlled by a moderator that have to, or an admin, that we aren't really supposed to be communicating on those forums on social media. Is that not correct? That's what I got out of the training that we had with the School Board Association. And when I looked at the statute itself, it designates a difference between closed groups that in order for you to get in, you have to go through a moderator or an admin to be admitted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is the conservative reading of that statute. Where I struggle with it is I sat down with the statute with a friend of mine who's in the IT world and works in social media, and I asked him if that is a clear definition, and his answer was no. That there are groups out there that wouldn't literally fall within that, and maybe Facebook is a bad example, because I do think for a closed group in Facebook, you do have to have permission to get in, but that there are other platforms that have closed groups that do not require permission. They simply require an opt-in to participate in them. And so he drew that distinction. But Shelley, I think your point's a good one. The most conservative answer is to not participate in those closed groups. And I think there's some gaps in this that are going to get closed over the years as we figure out exactly what that means.
Yeah, I was specifically referring to Facebook because we have several parent groups that are closed and you have to go through a moderator, and they also have the power to edit and change or leave comments out based on their opinions or the way that they see things. So it's kind of can be a dangerous place when someone else can control what what communications actually get out.
Right. No, it's a good point, and I'd compare it to Nextdoor, which is what my IT friend used as an example with me, because to get onto Nextdoor, you have to opt in. You have to decide to be, I'm in a neighborhood group for this entity through my neighborhood, but I didn't have to get approved to go in. I didn't have to go through a moderator. I had to just opt into that particular neighborhood. And the content, arguably the content is edited because they will take off offensive posts, but it's not otherwise altered. And so there's a lot of wiggly space for what's covered and what's not. I think you make a really good point on Facebook. The way that Facebook is structured, it probably is more of a problem. Then
Okay,
Rachel,
that answers my question. Thank you.
okay.
So the thing I wanted to bring up relates to when the district, well, and with the board's blessing, is working on new policy. It seems like if we are really going to follow the real intent of this, those things need to be brought to us in an iterative fashion, not bring us a nice policy wrapped up with a bow. We hear from the public all in one night. Maybe it's well advertised and maybe it's not. I just feel like if there's one thing to take away from this in terms of really how we do our work, we might want to think about doing things like that in a more iterative fashion. I'm thinking about our resolution that we did about inclusivity, and it was a great resolution, but it wasn't done in this fully open kind of way. The all gender bathroom thing, I think we were in favor of it conceptually, but I just think it's something for us to think about in terms of how we interact with staff about things that are policy oriented, not things that are, staff's work. But when we're looking at changing course, especially in, these socially inclusive kind of quests, which I think we're all on the same page of, but that we also tiptoe around because some parts of our community struggle with them. And I think the more open we can be about the process, it will serve us better.
And Rachel, if I could just jump in, we unfortunately haven't had the time, but I'm going to be proposing some things to the board very soon where we use a model that starts with especially related to policy, a board workshop that's open to the public so that you can give direction in the appropriate setting regarding where you'd like us to go, out to the community where there could be connection and consultation regarding insights, back to the board so that when staff's putting forward recommendations, it's actually grounded in what you believe in the first place, informed by the community and then back to what you believe as the elected officials. So I have some ideas around this that I've kind of been thinking about in light of my first few months here and wanting to bring those to you, because I'm in full agreement with what you just said, that there are strategies we could use to make the whole thing very public and engaging, with still keeping you as the board in the driver's seat related to policy and direction. So just a few quick thoughts on that.
That sounds great, because I think one thing we're dealing with currently and post-COVID is we have a lot more people watching what we're doing, and good or bad, our work is much more public now, and we just need to make a very, conscientious effort in making that work, optimizing how that works. So John, I really appreciate that you're already thinking that way.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. And this issue is not a Brown Act issue per se, but it is a transparency issue. It's back to that spirit versus the letter of the law. And we talked a little bit about board policies at the beginning under board governance. There are some districts that just take the CSBA policies and adopt them and they're done. There's no discussion. A lot of the really high functioning districts I work with take a lot of the policies, I shouldn't say a lot, take key policies that are important to the community, that have a lot more depth and substance to them, and do have a more public process on them, whether at a board meeting, whether in a workshop, et cetera. And I think it's helpful, it's useful to do that. The one thing I did have one district decided that they were going to do that with every single policy that they have, and they never got anywhere because there's too many policies. And I mean, let's face it, you have one policy that just says we're going to comply with the Brown Act, and it's got various provisions from the Brown Act in it. Every school district has those. Those are just mechanical, here's what the law says, we're going to comply with this. One that I think of that I dealt with recently was there was a lot of attention in the Bay Area to flying rainbow flags. That was a hot topic in a lot of school districts, and it sort of hit its zenith of discussion when the city of Dublin denied a request to fly the rainbow flag, was in all the local news. And then they changed reverse course and decided to let it fly. And so I worked with a number of districts that had very public, very open discussions of what's the feeling on this? And if we are allowing this flag to fly, what other flags are we going to fly? And that got us into interesting discussions of governmental speech, because a school district has its own free speech right as a governmental body to decide what to do on these things. And it ended up being, I thought, a very rich discussion. My one caveat is, of course, again, pick the big ones, pick the important ones, and don't get bogged down in the technical ones, at least not too far. Okay. Let's go to the next slide.
I ask some specific
yeah,
questions
please.
about social media. So in regards to like not responding, if I was on Twitter in my the way that I'm envisioning myself using social media, and I don't even know if this is correct, but is that I have my own personal Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, in my personal world. And then I have Trustee Laura Bratt, at Trustee Laura Bratt or Trustee Laura Bratt SRVUSD in Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, that kind of thing. And so the things that I'm kind of amplifying through that trustee profile are school related things such as, sharing an event that's happening at Doherty Valley High School, or an article that the Californian wrote, that the school newspaper wrote, or that kind of thing, or something that I see from EdSource that I kind of want to share. Is that appropriate? Is that acceptable? As long as I'm not, saying, I really believe that we need to do this because, or you need to go here because I think that it is, as long as I'm not giving an opinion, is that acceptable?
Yeah, I mean, that's the sharing of information that the statute now seems to allow. Doing it really doesn't distinguish between whether you're doing it on a personal platform or, I'm there officially as a board member. The same rules can apply either way. And, one of the lessons that we learned in recent years under the Public Records Act, board members used to think, well, if I use my district email, then it's a public record, but if I use my personal email, it's not. And the court said, no, it doesn't matter whether you're doing personal, whether you're using the, at SRVUSD or your Google account, the same rules apply either way. But beyond that, I think, providing that kind of information, I think this actually was an attempt by the legislature to clean this up, to say, yes, you can put something out there about there's an open house at X school on Y date. Before, people used to say even that might be a Brown Act problem.
So then if, let's say that I see something that Rachel has shared on Twitter about an event at San Ramon Valley High School, and can I retweet that? Or is that, or if I see an event and I tweet it out and Rachel sees that same event and she tweets it out, is that kind of violating that response or that, quorum of information being pushed out? I mean, I know that's—
Yeah, as we read it, and this is our reading, if you retweet what another board member did, but you don't respond directly to that board member, it's okay under the statute.
Okay.
The conservative answer is don't do it. I mean, we're back to, again, so are you commenting on what they said? And boy, there's a big difference in my mind between retweeting, there's the, band competition is going to be on this date at such and such school, versus board member A puts out their opinion about something, I think it's finally time we talk seriously about getting crossing guards. And then you retweet that starts to feel more like you're commenting on back to that person in some ways. So this is all going to be tested in the coming years, as I said. But I think if it's really just kind of district business, mundane, publicly available information, this statute seems to say you can send it and you can retweet it.
Okay. And then
Is part of that related to if you are sharing a fact versus sharing an opinion? I mean, the fact that there's an open house at blah, blah, blah school is not an opinion. It's just sharing information. But I'm so excited about blah, blah, blah is an opinion.
Yeah, and that goes back to Ken's question about what does information mean, and the statute doesn't define it. I think that a judge looking at it would probably take into account, was this a fact? And we all now know, just because you say it's a fact doesn't necessarily mean it is a fact on social media. But if it's truly just a verifiable, that yes, such and such school is open effective X date, I just don't see the likelihood you're going to get in trouble. I do start getting worried when it starts getting more into those sort of opinion related things. I'm so excited. And there's a difference even there. I'm so excited that Cal High's football team won the championship. Is very different than I'm so excited that the superintendent is putting on the agenda consideration of whether to have crossing guards. That feel different. And so I hate talking about the law as what it feels like, but I think that's what a judge would do with this. Does it feel like you were trying to communicate in a way that was sort of closing a loop between the quorum of the board, or does it feel like you were just reacting or providing something that was a basic fact? And I think that would make a difference.
And what if it was, what if it's like an op-ed about, inclusive curriculum that was shared by EdSource?
Yeah, again, as we read the statute, if you retweet that, you're okay. As we read the statute, if there's an article in the paper that talks, I'm going to use school reopening because that's obviously the most controversial thing for every school district we work with. If there's an editorial advocating for or against school reopening until testing is available, whatever else it says, and you forward that out, the statute seems to say you're fine. Does that mean that somebody's not going to come along and say, well, I saw that you forwarded that, and I saw that, board members B and C also forwarded it. Doesn't that mean that 3 of you are in favor of this? I'd argue no. It's just, we saw an article that was interesting and we sent it out. Now, if you send it out with a statement that says, I really agree with everything in this article, and 3 of you do that, it starts to make me feel a whole lot more nervous. So staying neutral is good.
That makes sense. And then I have one last kind of specific question, I guess. So as a parent with kids in the schools, I'm in groups, parent groups, like the, Grizzly class of 22. And so if I go in there as Laura Bratt and I'm, responding to a poll about something specific around graduation or whatever, but something that it has to do with school business, and it might even have to do with policy. Is that something I can do as an individual, as a parent, or should I just completely avoid those groups? And
yeah, that is a great question. And it goes back to our board governance piece too. There's not a neat and clean, easy answer. I always say is when you're elected to the school board, you don't give up your rights as a parent. That said, I will also tell you that as a parent in the district, well, formerly a parent in the district because my kids graduated, when issues came up at their school that I was interested in or that were affecting my kids, I very purposefully stayed out of them because I didn't want anybody to say, well, isn't he the district's lawyer and he's saying he's unhappy with this too? I wanted to avoid any entanglement. So I can't say that you're not allowed to go into that, you know, the personal forum. It's absolutely allowed to you. It's your free speech right. I think you just have to navigate very carefully. And again, making clear to people, this is me as an individual or as a parent, not as a board member, versus this is me as a board member. For purposes of this new law, the real question is, do you have other members in that closed group with you that are going to be getting your opinion on that? And it goes back to a little bit of what Shelley was raising about some of the closed groups. So what I would say is stay in there as a parent, but be extraordinarily circumspect about sharing your opinion. And when you do talk, make sure you're noting, this is as a parent of a student in X grade at Y school, not in my role as a board member. For me, my personal decision was always just, I stayed out of all things San Ramon Valley Unified School District for 14 years that my kids were around or whatever it was, because I didn't want anybody to get that entanglement. But I was still the president of a booster group and I was still, I still did my thing. If I even had one incident where there was an issue that was coming up within the group that I was a booster group of, that even though I was the president, I stepped out of it. I said, this could land on my desk later, so I'm not going to be involved in this decision. So you just have to check yourself a lot.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Well, would you all be surprised to know that whenever I do a Brown Act presentation, that the most questions I get and the most discussion we have is on social media and emails? Same with public records. So you've lived up to the reputation, because these are some of the hardest issues. And actually, if we go to the next slide, we pretty much covered what this has to say. If there was such a thing as a reply all button on your computer, I would tell you to rip it off as soon as you're elected to a school board. There's a lot of problems with people using reply all, responding to communications to the board. So if you get a message from the superintendent that is sent to the whole board that has information on something and you have questions or concerns you want to send back, send them to the superintendent. Don't use reply all. People more and more are using the BCC feature where they will send something out so that if you respond, it doesn't respond to the whole group. It goes to the through the BCC channels and it just goes directly to the superintendent. And then the last thing on chat rooms and social media sites, I didn't mention chat rooms. I always share this story because it's a funny story, but we had a situation that was of great concern in a community. And there was a community forum that started up and there was a chat room that got put together for a live discussion of this issue affecting the school district. And 2 board members got on that chat room and were talking to people. They were listening, they were sharing their thoughts. They were very clear, we're here as individuals, not here as board members. And only after the meeting did the 3rd person who was in that meeting, who was on the board, say, hey, I was in that chat room too. And I was chatting too. I was Fluffy Bunny 22. I will always remember that name, Fluffy Bunny 22. And they hadn't used their real name because it's chat rooms. People often have just set up nicknames or whatever. And so they had 3 board members discussing district business and 2 of them didn't realize it. And 1 of them didn't think to say, hey, we shouldn't all be in the chat room. If you ever find yourselves in a chat room or in any other context where there are a quorum of you there and you're discussing district business, 1 of you is going to have to leave the room. It's just that straightforward. And before the internet, it was if 3 of you went to, again, the city council meeting or the community meeting and were active participants in that, not just watching, 1 of you might have to leave if it wasn't noticed as a board meeting. Also, always keep in mind appearances. Even though you can passively receive information, what does it look like when you have a quorum of the board in one place? The famous case on that was there was a local city council that would have a meeting, I think it was once a month, at Buttercup Pantry in Pleasanton. And they would sit around and they would talk about their personal lives. This was their chance to get to know each other. And the rule was no city business, we're just talking about our kids and our lives and what's going on. It's our chance to know each other. Well, one day a reporter got wind that 5 city council members were meeting at Buttercup Pantry once a month in the morning. And so he assumed that they were meeting to discuss city business, which from everything I've heard, they weren't. But it made the front page of the newspaper and they took a picture and there's the 5 city council members sitting there having breakfast together. So they stopped doing it. And I'm not saying you can't socialize with each other, but think about what it looks like. Think about appearances, whether on social media or in person. Okay, let's go on to another confusing topic. The next slide. This is another one of those where a lot of districts I work with don't quite get this right because they don't realize what it is, which is if the board creates a committee or a subcommittee of the board, so community committee or subcommittee of the board, whatever it is, by any formal action, and the courts have defined formal to be really, really broad. So basically it's any board direction on this. That is a Brown Act body. That is a body that is bound by the Brown Act. Now, some that we know, if you have a Citizens Bond Oversight Committee that is appointed by the board, the statute applicable to Citizen Bond Oversight Committees expressly says it is bound by the Brown Act. So that's an easy one. But what if the board wants to set up a committee on fill in the blank community issue, some issue of interest to the community or of issue to the district? And so the board says, hey, superintendent, will you appoint a committee to go look at that and report back to you and to the board? That starts to sound like it was a formal board action to the superintendent to appoint the committee. You may have created a Brown Act committee. And the reason that's important is once you create a committee that is a Brown Act committee, they're bound to follow the basic tenets of the Brown Act. Notice meetings, a quorum can't discuss things amongst themselves. The meetings have to be in public. They have to post an agenda, all of the basic tenets of the Brown Act. So think of these poor community volunteers you just put on a Brown Act body and you didn't tell them they were a Brown Act body. So you have to be really mindful when you're creating these positions. Now, if the superintendent comes to you and says, I really think I'd like to get community input on this, and I'm going to go out and form a committee of my own and bring the information back to the board, and the board says, thank you, that is probably not a Brown Act body because the board didn't take action to approve it. They didn't direct the superintendent to do it. They didn't tell the superintendent, this is how many times you're going to meet. That's what we sometimes call a superintendent's committee. And that is not bound by the Brown Act. And superintendent committees, by the way, can have board members on it. The superintendent could reach out to a board member and say, board member X, this is a passion of yours. This is something that you obviously feel really strongly about. I'd love to have you sit in on the committee meetings. Not required. As long as the board's not approving that, it's probably not a Brown Act body. But where this gets confusing is the next slide, is an exception that's laid out in the Brown Act. So for years and years and years, districts I've worked with said, well, if it's a standing committee, it's a Brown Act committee. It has to comply with the Brown Act. If it's an ad hoc committee, it doesn't. So if it's just a temporary committee, it doesn't. That's not what the Brown Act says. So I'm here to tell you what the Brown Act actually says. The following kind of committee is an ad hoc committee that is exempt from the Brown Act. It has to meet all 4 of these characteristics. This is laid out in statute. It has to be purely advisory with no decision-making authority. So you're not having it select something, you're just having it bring back opinions on something. Second, it has to be composed solely of less than a quorum of the board. What does that mean? It means if you have a 5-member board, you can have a subcommittee of 2 board members who are appointed to study something or to review something and report back to the board. But if it has 1 other community member on it, if it has 1 administrator who's formally part of the committee, it is no longer an ad hoc body. It is again bound by the Brown Act if the board took action to direct those 2 board members to be on the committee. The solution for that is you don't have a committee that's 2 board members, the superintendent and the director of curriculum. You have a subcommittee that is 2 board members and their staff who attends all of their meetings are the superintendent and the curriculum director. So you can control that a little bit. The third thing is it has to have no continuing subject matter jurisdiction. What does that mean? It means if you have a committee that every year you appoint members to year after year after year, even though the membership is changing, it is probably a continuing committee. And so I've worked with school districts that have subcommittees on, I'm going to just give you an example. They'll have a budget subcommittee. So 2 board members will get appointed each year to work with the superintendent on the budget before it goes to the whole board. Fine, great, that's a wonderful thing. If you do it year after year after year, that's a body that has a continuing subject matter jurisdiction. It's no longer an ad hoc body. It again may become bound by the Brown Act. So you have to be very careful about that. And then the last piece, which is usually doesn't come up that much, is if the board sets a meeting schedule, then it's no longer an ad hoc or body under the Brown Act. The reason this is important is school districts make this mistake all the time. They appoint lots of committees without thought to whether or not that committee is a Brown Act body. The committee goes off and does its work. It reports back to the board. Somebody doesn't like what they have to say, and aha, it's a redo. You didn't agendize the meetings of the notices of these meetings, the agendas. And therefore, the committee has to go back, have a formal meeting that's publicly noticed, take that back to the board. It just delays progress is all it does. So I would, I don't want to spend too long on committees. If there's no questions on that, I will keep going. It's just one of those common areas. So the next one, when can board meetings happen? There's 3 possibilities for you. And I want to clear up another misconception on this. Regular meetings, you have to give 72-hour notice. You have to post your agenda 72 hours in advance. Special meetings, you have to post your agenda 24 hours in advance. You can always do more, but those are the minimum. Emergency meetings, I'll come back to in a little bit. Emergency meetings, basically, it's a threat to safety. It's there's been a terrorist attack. There's been an earthquake. It's very, very rare. You have to do those with a 1-hour notice to the newspaper. Very, very rare. Twice in 27 years have I had that happen. On the regular meetings and special meetings, here's another mistake that people make. They say, well, we gave 72 hours notice, so it must be a regular meeting. A regular meeting by statute is defined only as your regularly scheduled meeting calendar at a board-adopted calendar, usually the calendar you adopt at your organizational meeting or shortly thereafter. That's a regular meeting. And the reason that this is important is there's certain actions in the education code, the government code, you can only take at a regular board meeting. The most famous of them is you can only approve a superintendent's contract at a regular board meeting. So I've had districts that look at that and say, okay, well, we want to approve the contract next week. Let's have a 72-hour notice meeting and we'll call it a regular meeting. What they should have done is gone to the board at a regular board meeting that was on the calendar and amended their calendar to add a regular meeting on that particular date. 3 times in my career, I've had superintendent contracts have to get rescinded and reissued at a future meeting, reapproved because of this exact mistake. So I just wanted to clear up that misconception that it's a regular meeting just because you gave 72 hours notice. Nope, it's got to be on an adopted board calendar to be a regular meeting. A big difference between these meetings, regular meetings, and we'll talk about this more in just a moment, regular meetings, people can make comments on anything within your jurisdiction. Special meetings, they can only comment on what's on the agenda. It's a narrow band of what can be discussed at the meeting. So the next slide. This is just to make you aware, when you have meetings, they're supposed to have at least a quorum of the people present in San Ramon Valley Unified School District. So you don't all get to go to Lake Tahoe. You can call into meetings. Obviously, there's been rules loosened up for COVID. But even without that, when there's live meetings, if you've properly agendized the meeting, you can have a board member telephone in. The agenda has to say where the board member is going to be. The board member has to post the agenda where they are, and the public has to be allowed to attend where they are. True story, I was in Luxembourg. Yes, I was in Luxembourg. I always love to say that. And I walked by a door that was open to a hotel room. It was cracked open slightly, and somebody was talking on the phone. I was thinking, why is their door open? They're speaking English. I looked at the door as I went by, and it was I think it was the Modesto Mosquito Abatement District board meeting. And they had that posted on the door of their hotel. And all I could think as I went by, I went, wow, they did that right. But it meant I could have gone and sat in his hotel room. I could have sat next to him on his bed and listened to him on the telephone, because that is allowed under the Brown Act. Now we're in a weird time right now, if we go to the next slide, because of COVID. And last March, the governor issued some executive orders. Cindy, can we get that next slide? I may have lulled her to sleep. There we go. So there's some things that are different right now that you're not normally allowed to do. This is really important for the new board members to know if and when the world ever goes back to normal and we have in-person meetings, these things will revert back. As far as the meeting, all locations having to be open, like the open hotel door in Luxembourg, that is on hold right now under the executive order of the governor. You don't have to identify where the board members are calling in from. You don't have to post the agendas at their locations. You don't have to allow public comments at all those locations. And a majority of you can actually be outside the boundaries of the district. But there are other rules that kick in. To be conservative, you really should take all votes by roll call. which is the rule for when you have people calling in. You should obviously address any technical problems as far as people actually being able to see it. But then certain other things that come out of the governor's order is that you're supposed to provide the ability to observe and address telephonically or otherwise electronically. So people have to be able to observe and participate in your meeting somehow electronically. You all have got that pretty well worked out how you're doing it. It's up to the district to figure out how you're going to allow that. You have to provide notice of the method. How do I get onto a board meeting when it's being held virtually? And you have to indicate what the procedure is for resolving accessibility requests, which basically is if there's some reason that you can't access the meeting online, you're visually impaired, whatever else it is, here's the person in the district to call, and they can help you with that. And we worked with the district on your notices and took care of all of that. So the next slide.
Hey, Harold, quick question. Our practice on the previous slide before the COVID experience has been that if a board member has been, let's say, out of town on business, for instance, they could participate only in closed sessions, not in open sessions. So this seems to be broader than that. Maybe you can explain that a little bit.
And Ken, we did adjust that a few times for Denise. Denise was able to do open session, but she posted the agenda on her front door.
Okay. So
Yeah,
Harold, is that okay?
Probably not. I was trying to find a delicate way of saying that.
I mean, it was noticed and her address was given, and it was like Luxembourg. It was just in Danville.
Okay. Well, the question is for closed session though, and this is, I think, a misconception that's out there. Because it's only closed session, we don't have to have the person notice at their house because nobody can come sit in closed session with them anyway.
We would still notice during closed session, right down to the hotel room and that type of thing.
Okay.
So giving full notice, but we would only do it, except for what Rachel's talking about with Denise, we would always just do it for, when situations came up, but only for closed session. And that member would then not be present for the open session portion of the meeting.
Yeah, that is something you did by your choice. The way you described it just now, that is allowable. It's fine if you want to have the person also be in the open session, though, as long as a quorum of the board is in the district. You can have them do the open and closed, but if you make the decision just to make it the general rule, it'll be closed only, it's fine. The one nuance is that members of the public have a right to comment on any item on the board agenda, including closed session items, which means when we go back to the normal world and they post at their hotel or their home or wherever it is, you do have to have them open the meeting at their house and allow for public comment at their house or hotel before escorting people out, closing the door, and having the meeting closed. So that's the one nuance that I think a lot of people get tripped up on.
And I need to stand corrected. Denise did not participate in open because we didn't have the technology for her to be able to listen in at that time. She corrected me.
Okay, yeah, it's always been closed session, though we've done that a number of times, but yeah, I couldn't recall an open session.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, I mean, I work with a lot of districts that have had board members call in open session, either because it's a critical issue or the person is, ill. We had one person who had an extended hospital stay and actually participated in a board meeting from their hospital room. They got dressed, which we were all worried about. So they got dressed and sat in a chair instead of laying in the bed and happily made a full recovery. But we do see this from time to time. Talking about closed session, though, great segue into closed session to talk about it. I mentioned earlier, there are certain opportunities you have to go into closed session. The general rule is everything is an open unless there's a specific rule or a specific exception that allows you to go into closed. So if we can go to the next slide, there's some procedural things you have to do around closed session. One is, this is kind of interesting. It says in the Brown Act that you're supposed to announce in open session the basis for the closed session. And a lot of districts say, well, we have announced it because it's right there on our agenda. It's our posted agenda says why we're going into closed session. A super conservative read of this, and a lot of districts still do it this way, is that you actually should say in closed session today, and you just briefly recap the closed session topics. That just tracks what's on your agenda. Do I think that is absolutely necessary? I don't think it's absolutely necessary. I think you're in substantial compliance because you've already alerted the public by posting the agenda. I think this is an anomaly that's left over in the Brown Act, but I make you aware that some districts more conservatively do it. More importantly, coming out of closed session, if the board took action in closed session, there are obligations to report out what the action was taken and what the vote was. And the law was clarified a few years ago. When I say what the vote was, you can't just say it was a 4-1 vote. You have to say it was a 4-1 vote with board members A, B, C, and D voting for, and board member E voting against. So that's something that we'll talk about a little bit more. There are some times that you can delay what you're reporting out. You don't have to do it that night. Classic example, again, I work a lot with property issues. If you approve a property deal, but the other side hasn't approved it yet, so you say, yes, we'll sell it to them for $100,000, but you don't know if they're going to accept it yet, you don't have to report it out until there's an acceptance. And there's some other exceptions. And then agenda descriptions. There is in the government code a get out of jail free card provision that basically says if you use agenda descriptions for closed sessions that track closely with what the safe harbor language is, that's what we generally call it, the safe harbor language. It's in government code section 54954.5 if you're ever bored. It actually gives you the language you can use on an agenda. If you use that language or you're substantially similar to it, you've complied with the Brown Act, as long as that's actually what you're talking about in closed session. And so that was the legislature's gift that we try to track as closely as possible. These two subsections there that I listed really should come out of here. They're new clarified subsections about agendizing things for public banks, which you all don't have. So we're going to go to the next slide. So here are the main allowable closed session topics. These are examples. This is not exhaustive of all of them. A lot of these will look familiar to a lot of you. One of them is real property negotiations. And one of the funny things about this is that it's actually not even required to be agendized when you go into closed session to talk to your labor negotiator, which you see the bullet later. But it is required under the Brown Act to be agendized to go in to talk to your real property negotiator. Most districts go ahead and agendize both, and that's the better practice. But I just mentioned that because I came across a district recently that said, well, because under federal law and other state laws, we don't have to actually put down labor negotiations, which again, it's always a better idea to do it. And the Brown Act allows you to do it. We're going to stop agendizing real property negotiations as well. And I'd say, whoa, different rules. So there's real property negotiations. That's to give direction to your real property negotiator. Litigation, I put litigation there as a shorthand. What the Brown Act actually says is that you can go into closed session to get consultation with your legal counsel. It's conference with legal counsel regarding litigation or potential litigation. That's a mistake districts make, and I'm not just saying this because I want to get us more work. You are actually supposed to have an attorney there or on the phone. At a very bare minimum, you should have advice that has been given to the board in writing that is being shared in closed session. That one's a little bit less clear than if you actually have the attorney there either in person or on the phone. Because the whole idea of this is to protect attorney-client privilege. You're also supposed to identify whether you're doing pending litigation. That's actually a lawsuit that's been filed. You're supposed to cite the case. You're doing potential litigation because you're thinking of filing a lawsuit, or potential litigation because you're exposed to litigation. And there's rules around disclosures on all of that. All we can do is, I'm not going to go into detail here, is encourage you whenever you're putting something down as a conference with legal counsel regarding potential litigation, really check with your legal counsel on the right way to agendize it. Appointment, employment, evaluation, performance, discipline, employee-related issues generally are okay for closed session. There's a funny little thing in the safe harbor language. If you're talking about disciplining an employee or dismissing an employee, you can go in under employee discipline, dismissal, release, and not list the position, which is great because it lets you have a frank conversation. If you're evaluating somebody's performance or if you're appointing somebody, you have to identify the position on the agenda. You have to say performance evaluation superintendent or appointment of principal or whatever it is that you're going to say. So it's a little more detailed. Labor negotiations I talked about, you don't technically have to even agendize this under other applicable laws that trump the Brown Act, but everybody does. And it's a good practice to include that on your agenda. Student discipline matters. You can read through the Brown Act until you're 100 years old and you'll never find anything about student information. It's federal and other parts of the education code that say that you can't discuss students in open session. In fact, for years and years and years, the education code has said, when you're talking about expulsion of a student, you're supposed to identify the student by name in open session and vote in open session. Federal law trumps that, thankfully, and the Department of Justice actually issued an opinion on this years back that you may have to vote in open, but you do not identify the student by name. Usually it's done by an identifying number. And then public building security, you can go into closed session. For example, if there's a terroristic threat against the school, you can meet with the police chief in closed session for obvious reasons, right? You don't want to have that discussion in open session. So those are the allowable closed session topics. A little bit more on the next slide. We talked a little bit about this already, maintaining.
Harold, sorry, just one quick question on real property negotiations. It's always under the maybe misconception that for closed session, it wasn't for both sale and purchase of real property. It was just one or the other. I wasn't sure which one. Is it all kinds of, not that we have those kind of issues a lot, but just wondering, because that was something I just remembered from way back when.
Yeah, that may be a way back when. The current law is you can discuss sales, leases, or exchanges are all allowable. So anything where you're trading, you're selling, you're disposing of, you're acquiring property, whether it's lease or sale, now that's all okay. There are rules that are different for the two that have to do with how you can spend money from it. But as far as going into closed session to discuss it, you can do both.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Yeah. And that's for board members who've been around for a long time and have been at this for a long time, because the law keeps changing. That's why I say, there's a lot of these things where we're still doing it the way we did it 15 years ago. Well, Brown Act got revised. So that may be one of those. This slide we've already talked about, maintaining closed session confidentiality. It's critical. It's potentially a legal violation if you release information from closed. Closed is closed, and there are cases and attorney general opinions that talk about when you have a closed session, it's supposed to be a fully closed session. You can't have a semi-closed session. So we sometimes get questions about, well, we have somebody making us a proposal on something. Can we bring them into closed session? Well, if it's a real property matter, the answer is no, because the whole idea is for the board to give direction to the real property negotiator, not to engage in negotiations in closed session. Another example that districts struggle with is how many people sit in your closed session. Is it really necessary for your director of facilities to be sitting in on a matter where you're discussing a teacher discipline issue? And so it's just something to think about, to the extent you're really supposed to have a necessary role in that meeting. We can go to the next slide. When you report out action, I did mention this, you can defer the reporting out of certain actions. So real property is an example. If you have a settlement agreement with an employee, for example, until it's been approved by them, you don't report it out. And because of an oddity in the law, if the person is over the age of 40 under the ADEA, any settlement agreement they reach with you that involves their removing themselves from the district, so it includes a resignation or their departure from the district, doesn't become final for 7 days after you've approved it, during which they can rescind it. And that is because apparently people over the age of 40 need extra time to make up their mind. It's just, again, an anomaly in the law. And I say that as somebody who's well over 40. So that's a case where you wouldn't report it out because they have 7 days to rescind. So there are certain actions that you don't have to report out. It is always a good idea if you're working with legal counsel and you're going to be talking about something in closed session with or without them there, that you ask for their guidance on when do we have to report out and what do we have to report. You do have to report the votes of all the members, as I mentioned too. You have to identify who voted how. And then the next slide, under the Brown Act, again, remember, if you intentionally violate the Brown Act, if you're having secret meetings amongst a quorum of the board, knowing you're violating the Brown Act, it can be a crime. You don't see that very often. It is not prosecuted very often. But there are also different measures that people can bring if they think you violated the Brown Act. They can go to the district attorney. The district attorney can actually file a civil action against you, not just a criminal action, to enforce compliance. They also can make a demand on you either to cure and correct what you've done or to cease future violations. This will sound familiar to you because we just took an action with the board recently for the board to commit that it was going to change the way it agendized something moving forward. The board can also cure and correct by going back if there's been an alleged violation, and without admitting that there's been a violation, they can rescind their prior action and take a new action. And basically it may be the same action again, but they have to then have it properly agendized. So these are those do-over moments that you want to avoid, where somebody is unhappy with the decision you've made and they want you to have to go back and do it again, often to delay the implementation. It's why it's as important as possible to track the Brown Act as closely as you can, even though you only have to have substantial compliance. We go to the next slide. I mentioned the one-click agenda access, which again is an important thing to check. This is if you have an outside service that provides your agenda. So again, Board Docs or one of their competitors, that agenda is supposed to be retrievable, downloadable, indexable, and electronically searchable. If you have your own agendas that you prep and it's one click, that's probably good enough that it's the one click from the main board page. Then the next page, just a recent Brown Act update, which is that a student or a parent or a guardian can now request in writing from the district that no information about them be included in board minutes. This is a brand new law, just went into effect. What this basically means is if a parent stands up and talks about their student's situation at a school, they can request in writing that their name not be included or the name of their student not be included in the minutes of the meeting. I know I'm dancing on the head of a pin. This is a narrow little issue, but it's one that I did just want to call to your attention in case you get one of these requests. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to do a time check here because we have only about 5 minutes left to go. As I suspected would happen, we did not get all the way through. We did get all the way through the Brown Act, which is lovely. We were going to spend a little bit of time talking about the conduct of board meetings. And what I want to do is just check in with you, and maybe this is as much for John as it is for the board president. My thought is maybe I can just kind of paint the tableau of what is to come, sort of some of the big picture takeaways on this, as opposed to trying to go through the slides. And then if the board would like, we can come back at a future meeting. We haven't covered the Public Records Act, conflicts of interest, to finish up on the conduct of meetings. Does that sound like a good approach for the last few minutes?
I would certainly see this as a good way to go. Maybe Susanna, if you have a comment?
Yes, I would love to for us to really talk about the board meetings, because I do have a couple of questions with regards to how best practices of having very effective. What can we do to make our meetings more effective, because really that's the only time that we as a whole board, right, can conduct our business. So with regards to others, we can set another time, but yes, please give us kind of a big picture.
Yeah, so let me give you a few big picture thoughts that we'll end on. And again, I would be happy to come back, and when we do the others, we can do a deeper dive. Most boards don't talk about the conduct of their board meetings. And this is one of those conversations where when we get into the depth of it, it should not just be me talking to you. It should be you talking to one another about what practices you want. From all the data that I have seen, from all the information I've read, there's great information out of the Illinois School Boards Association that really studied board meetings and looked at, amongst other things, how long board meetings go, and talked about what's efficient and what is effective for board meetings. And the fact is that the data bears out that highly functional boards in high performing school districts run their meetings differently than those in non-high performing districts with boards that are less functional. And there's certain characteristics. One of them is a carefully planned agenda. You don't just put everything on every agenda. You really think through, maybe you have one big ticket item that night, so you don't put on 4 big ticket items on that night. You have a board policy already in place in the district that says your meetings will end by 10 unless you continue them. There's a reason for that, right? We don't do our best work at midnight or at 1 in the morning. And shy of just taking away everybody's caffeinated drinks, it's good to have methods in place. It's good to work with each other about how you're going to keep each other on track. One of the big takeaways on all of the data that's out there and everything I've seen is forever coming back to one reality, which is you only get to meet usually a couple times a month. That is the only time you have to conduct the business of the district with the board. If you had a Fortune 500 company that managed a budget like you budget and you told them you could only make decisions twice a month, they'd all go under. I mean, that would be it, right? My dad spent a life in business and is still marvels at what I tell him about what school boards have to accomplish. So you've got to get important work done in very short periods of time. When you do that, you are having a business meeting. This is a business meeting of the school board to get information and make decisions. You're doing it in front of the public. The Brown Act says you have to do it in front of the public. You're being transparent. This is not a town hall meeting. This is not a meeting of the public that you're attending. You are in control of that meeting, and the public is allowed to comment at a regular meeting. They're allowed to comment on anything on the agenda and make general comments on anything within the jurisdiction of the district. But they do so within time limits that you set and that your board policies give the board president authority to shorten if you need to or lengthen if you have a lot of speakers on a topic. And what we often see is where things get out of control is when the meeting becomes a town hall meeting. And you have a lot of public speakers, you have people interrupting each other, you have people trying to engage in dialogue with the board. Board meetings are not the place for dialogue with the community. They're a place for you to conduct your meeting publicly, your business publicly, while the public observes, while the public gets to comment. They get their turn. Each speaker gets their turn. They don't get repeated turns. One of the weirdest board meetings I ever went to, and I have to end off this story, is I went to a school board that I hadn't worked with before. It was on a real property matter. I seem to be stuck on real property today. And I got there, and I always do research on the board, and they have 5 members, that's fine. And I got there and I'm sitting in the audience and the meeting starts, and there's 7 people sitting up at the front with the superintendent and the cabinet. And I thought, that's a lot of people up there. And it became really apparent as the meeting went that there were 7 board members, which made no sense to me because they only had 5 board members. And the weird thing is that 2 of the board members weren't exactly on the dais. They were sitting on folding chairs facing the audience next to the dais. And I couldn't figure out what was going on. So afterwards, I asked the superintendent, and I will always remember what he told me. He said, one of these is a former school board member who was voted off the board. One of these is a member of the community who wants to run for board and is a protege of that board member. And they insist on sitting at the front of the room. When the board member got voted off, he refused to leave the dais. And they face the room and they participate in board discussions. They were voting with the board, these 2. And the first thing I did with that district was got them to stop doing that practice, because this was not those 2 board members or former board member and maybe future board members meeting. It was a meeting of the school board, of the elected school board. It is a hard thing to do because the public is there and they want to engage with you. It's a tough, tough thing. So all I can tell you is if you want to have meetings that end on time, you can very respectfully implement time controls. We heard at your last meeting, there were some comments made, or I think it was your last one, that I sat in on, where some people in the audience were upset that there was visual for the board, but not for people speaking in the audience, that their face wasn't seen. They were also upset that they were not given as much time as the district's labor associations were given. There's case law that makes very clear that's all okay. You can decide to give more time to folks who work for the district, to your staff, to your board members. There are limits on the public's involvement. It doesn't mean you don't listen to them. It doesn't mean that they get shut down, but this is truly your meeting. And in a highly functional district, you very respectfully enforce that so you can get your work done in the limited time you have. So that's my biggest takeaway. And we can obviously drill down into this another time, but I'm now about 2 minutes over. So I am going to stop talking and throw it back to you to see if there's any final questions. And obviously, I'm more than happy to come back and finish up the rest of this on another day.
Harold, this isn't so much a question. It's just a comment that I would like our board to consider connecting back with Harold one last time on this particular matter, because I do believe it's important for you to have some discussion around the whole board meeting process. that you consider potentially adding some language to the bylaws so that it's done publicly in a session like this for anyone who's interested, but then it allows for you to decide if any adjustments to board meetings need to be made, because I know there have been conversations with me around, should we consider different strategies? And again, based upon everything we've learned today, I think that starting with you and Harold having the discussion, and then at another board meeting, decide formally about making any adjustments is a really, really important way forward. So I'm just going to offer that just as a thought for your consideration. And unless I hear otherwise from you individually, I'm just going to go ahead. And frankly, how about if I say it this way? I'm going to go ahead with Harold and working with Susanna to schedule another date so we can finish that. How about if I just put that out there in this session? And I'm seeing nods of heads, so we'll go ahead and do that as soon as we possibly can. Thanks.
Okay, any other questions or comments at this time from the board? If not, I'd like to.
I'll just, Susanna, I'll
Yeah,
just,
go ahead, Ken.
since you can't see me, yes, I was nodding my head. But also, I just want to thank Harold for his time and information. Even as a longtime board member, as you mentioned, Harold, you know, things do change, and it's really nice to be able to have the opportunity to take some time to go over these things and really understand, you know, some of the background that, like I say, either may have changed or some of those details that we keep hitting against, and maybe having a better strategy for how to move forward with more clarity. So thank you very much.
Anyone else? Otherwise, I do need to ask for any public comments. So this is a public workshop, so I need to do that. Do we have any? I don't think we have, right? Anyone from public? Okay.
We do not.
Okay. Right, thanks. So yes, like to echo Ken's sentiments to Harold. I've, you know, when I stepped into a role as appointed and gotten a bit of orientation and training, and of course attended, you know, the School Board Association sessions on how to do my job. But it's really, really great to actually sit into a whole workshop so that we know, right, the whole board is kind of like at the same place with regards to all these changes and things like that. And a little more clarity, and not just like, you know, each of us believing maybe or following, you know, certain things. So thank you so much for this opportunity. Okay. And if there's nothing else, I'm going to call this adjournment.
Susanna, if I can add just one quick thing.
Sure.
It's not exactly on our agenda, but I did want to thank Christine Harada and her education services staff for the really nice appreciation message that they all put together and sent out to us as a board today. I thought it was delightful to sit and watch. I really, really enjoyed it and want to thank you all for that. I'm sure my other fellow board members agree.
I echo that. That started my day today and it made me smile, and I really, really appreciated it.
Yes, me too. It was lovely to see everyone's faces. And I know as a new trustee, I haven't been able to get out and meet people, and it was nice to kind of put the names to faces and hear their voices. So thank you.
And I'll say thank you too, just so that we're all making it known. It was a very nice treat. Thank you.
I know, especially right, a start on a Monday. So, okay, great. Any last comments, questions? No? Then I'll go ahead and adjourn our workshop today. Thanks, everyone. And yes, we will get another session follow up with this one.